Hi everyone, how are we doing? We are definitely in the thick of it in April, and I think this is one of those months where if you're not in it or feeling it, you're going to be watching it. So, this could be definitely an interesting time collectively, an interesting time in the news, especially with Mercury, a planet of communication, eventually moving into Aries and applying to Neptune this week, which I will break down individually. But I think collectively, this could be a week where we start to see what I like to call, well, in my family, what we like to call the porky pies, the lies. Who's telling porky pies? Who's what's where has the truth been distorted? Mercury, Neptune can have that sort of influence, especially collectively. And as we come off of last week, moving into this week, Mars is going to continue applying to Saturn from roughly April 13th through the 19th. So we're going to feel, Mars is in rulership. Mars has a lot of strength here. Mars is pushing up against Saturn. So we could feel or see or sort of experience that action, that drive, that intensity for some of us even sort of intensify throughout this week. And again, before Mercury moves into Aries and applies to Neptune to maybe have us see the collective porky pies in the news, hopefully. But individually, I will break that down in terms of like what that could really mean for you on an individual level. But before Mercury moves into Aries and applies to Neptune, Mercury is going to hit that 29-degree mark in Pisces in sextile Uranus. So that can be in and of itself quite intense, especially because we're having another sextile with Uranus at the anaretic degree, that sense of urgency degree, intensity. And Mercury and Uranus can be quite stimulating. So we can definitely feel that potential intensity there as Mercury is then pushing into Aries, into going from water to fire. So that could be another sort of major energetic shift that some of us could feel after that sextile starts to separate on April 14th, April 15th. Then April 17th is a big day because this is when Mercury and Mars will be applying to Saturn in Aries. And they'll all kind of be sitting around the 7-degree mark in Aries, making a quincunx, which is sort of like that uncomfortable adjustment or necessary adjustment needed as these planets are sort of initiating new cycles, stories to kind of unfold. So some of us on an individual level might need to make some adjustments there, and I'll break that down in more detail. There'll also be a new moon around that time, conjunct Chiron, the wounded healer. So some of us could be, stepping into a new chapter that could really start to unfold over the next 5 or 6 months, but it might require us to work with Chiron a little bit, work with that wounded healer. And some of us might really love that energy. Some of us might really hate that energy. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. And I will do my best to break things down into more practical, in a practical approach, more digestible approach. And then we will sort of conclude this week really gearing up for next week, where Uranus will make that final ingress into Gemini for roughly the next 7 years. So this train is going to keep going. So let's dive into it. Hi, Aries Risings. So if you are listening and not watching, I am on April 13th, Monday. And this is when we start to see Mars separate from Neptune and start to push up and apply to Saturn. Now, this is happening in your Aries first house of self, physical body, how you take independent action. So all of this Aries stuff is really, it's happening in your first house of self. It is, you're in it. And with Mars now pushing up against Saturn for the majority of this week, I think this could shift a lot of Aries rising's focus, perseverance, commitment to creating sort of new cycles, new chapters, new things, initiating with Saturn ruled areas, which for Aries risings, Saturn rules your Aquarius 11th house of your social network, personal or professional, as well as your long-term goals, and your Capricorn 10th house of career, business, public recognition, or what brings you fulfillment. So this could be the point where a lot of Aries risings maybe intensely pursue, focus on, some of you could even be feeling this in your body, like viscerally wanting to take action to really create new desires, new motivation, a new plan of action regarding, maybe something that feels a little bit more fulfilling to you. Maybe initiating something within a current career, business, public recognition theme. But because Saturn also rules at Aquarius 11th house of yours, I think a lot of Aries risings might be heavily focused on, it's like not just finding the job or doing the thing for the job, but actually really integrating and focusing on, well, what is the long-term goal here? What is the long-term goal that supports me, supports my ability to move through the world, that feels good for me? So this is where the focus could really intensify this week, particularly around those Saturn-ruled themes, such as your career, your business, what feels fulfilling, those long-term goals, who you want to surround yourselves with that supports the career, the long-term goals. And I also want to point out too that at the same time, this is when Mercury is going to start getting pretty close to that 29th degree, where once we get to the 14th, yes. So once we get to April 14th, this is when Mercury is going to start to make an exact sextile to Uranus in your Taurus second house of earned income, self-worth, your value system. And so Mercury is at that 29th degree with Uranus. There's intensity. There can be a sense of urgency. Now, this is happening between your 12th house and your second house. So some of you might feel that mental intensity, mental pressure to make sort of innovation or change to sort of your value system, your self-worth, your financial situation. But because Mercury rules your Virgo 6th house of daily work, health, and routines, this could really be creating sort of an intense desire for opportunity to find work routines that not only support your health and your vitality, but also support sort of like the financial budget, the value system, the self-worth that also supports you. So I think a lot could be building for many Aries risings around, not just what could be building around sort of what feels fulfilling, the career, the long-term goals, but a lot of you could also be really trying to figure out the financial system, the value system that is going to support that, but also support sort of like your health and your vitality. maybe at this point, especially with so much that's happened in Pisces the past couple years, maybe some of you Aries risings, this might resonate for some Aries risings, where maybe it's you've been tested, you've been challenged, even mentally, you know, privately behind the scenes. And this could be the point where a lot of you might be really shifting your focus on like, I'm done. Like, I want to feel good. I want to focus on like the work, the routine. Like, some of you might hit that point this month where you're like, I'm done with suffering. I'm done with dealing with this. And some of you could be like relentlessly focusing on like something's got to give and this has to change. And I think some of you might really be focused on like, I'm tired of working a job that makes me sick, or I'm tired of, being able to focus on my health and, my vitality, but maybe not having like the job or the money. I think a lot of Aries risings, you might be looking for the way to step into a new chapter where you're fully supported in all these areas. And some of you might be relentlessly trying to figure out, how to do so. And so some of you might be heavily focused on those Mercury ruled areas in order to do so. And this is going to be your third house of communication, exchanging information, siblings, extended family. So some of you might be seeking information and conversation to kind of figure out where are the opportunities? Where can I make this shift? As well as the other Mercury ruled area, as I mentioned, is your Virgo 6th house of health, work, and routines. And some of you, like what I've noticed too out in the world is like some Aries risings have been going through health situations that has literally impacted your ability to focus on your job, your work, your long-term goals. So that's also another possibility here, playing into this intensity of like, maybe some of you are really you're ready to kind of close that chapter and figure out ways on how to balance all these areas of life. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. But then we get to, is it later on April 14th? I think so. Yeah, some of you, it's going to be late on the 14th, but definitely by Wednesday, April 15th. This is when Mercury finally makes that shift into your Aries first house of self, the physical body, how you take independent action. And I think, generally speaking, a lot of Aries risings, you're going to feel this shift. You're going to feel Mercury going from its place of detriment, or technically fall, where, it's been a little wonky there lately. And Mercury moves into Aries and starts gaining essential dignity. It starts gaining more strength. And this is sort of the barrier between, for Aries rising, sort of Mercury moving between, behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns, into your first house of self, the very visible sense of self, ability to take direction, identity, how you show up in the world. So Mercury's kind of going from behind the scenes to a very visible area now for you. And so some of you could literally, viscerally feel that shift. And Mercury is going to immediately apply to Neptune. Now, this could be, like I said, collectively, a lot of you could see sort of like the distortion of information, the distortion of truth. But I think individually, a lot of Aries rising could be sort of shifting around how you communicate, how you exchange information. Some of you could be seeing sort of changes to work, health, and routines. Because again, Mercury rules this Gemini third house of communication, exchanging information, as well as your Virgo 6th house of daily work, health, and routines. So this could be the point where some of you are ready to kind of shift, dissolve, surrender, outdated ways of communicating, exchanging information, your day-to-day lives, your routines, that impact your work and your health. So some of you might start to shift how you move in your daily routines, to start being able to see, how can I focus more on the work that I want to do, or the health that I want to feel, or take care of sort of the mundane, the errands, the appointments, the phone calls necessary in order to do so. So some of you could really be seeing sort of your work and or health routines shift, surrender, some parts of it dissolve, to gear up to then sort of move into Mercury applying to Saturn at this point later this week, where some of you might be starting to reconstruct those structures, routines that support the work, the health, the day-to-day, so to speak. So this could be the point where maybe you've been thinking about it for a while, and then Mercury applies to Neptune, and you're like, all right, it's time to shift around the way you live, the way you support your routines, your work, your health, so that you can start rebuilding and creating new cycles with those Mercury ruled areas as Mercury applies to Saturn later in the week, to reconstruct, to build, to create, more even logical. So like earlier this week, you might be kind of shifting, dreaming, kind of like seeing what's available. And then when Mercury applies to Saturn, a lot of times when Mercury applies to Saturn, it's like things get a lot more concrete. Things get a lot more logical or logistical. So there could be that shift. Now, April 17th is kind of a big day. So Friday, April 17th, we have, let's see, let me get the moon up here if you're watching. So I'm just going to jump to the new moon. So April 17th, if you're watching, you might be looking at the screen going, holy mother of God. There is Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Chiron, Sun and Moon in a new moon conjunct this Chiron in your first house of self, the physical body, how you show up in the world, how you take independent action. So my God, Aries Risings, you are literally going to be on fire. Okay. There's a lot to break down this day, but what I want to point out first, since we just discussed it, is that by April 17th, this is when Mercury is going to really start separating from that Neptune and be applying to Saturn with Mars. So we're going to have this interesting situation with Mercury, Mars, and Saturn sort of all joining up at this point. So it's sort of like the planet that rules your health and work routines, your communication. Mars, the planet that rules your physical body, as well as your resources, your long-term financial plans, are going to be pushing up and joining the planet that rules your career, your public recognition, and your long-term goals. So again, I think after this Neptunian business where things might kind of shift around, dissolve, surrender, Mercury and Mars are going to be applying to Saturn, I think, to really take action, to communicate, especially with Mercury literally ruling your Gemini third house of communication. And so I think a lot of Aries risings at this point might be ready to talk about it, might be ready to take action, really pursue it. But with it applying to Saturn, this could really heavily involve your career projects, public recognition, long-term goals, your social network, whether it's personal or professional, also playing into that, if that's applicable for many of you around this time. And how you are maybe getting more concrete, more logical, more sort of really just, again, with Mars in rulership, these planets are reporting to Mars. So it's sort of like they're all reporting to your action and your resources and your long-term sort of financial plan. So again, this could also involve financial situations as well. Then additionally, on April 17th, we have this new moon really forming. coming to fruition here. So again, a new moon in that first house, setting that new chapter, setting these new goals as these planets are really starting to push up against Saturn, really pushing up against the career, the public recognition, the long-term goals, the social network. And many of you saying, all right, let's initiate this new chapter. Let's plant these seeds. Let's start laying this foundation down to start culminating and working and building over the next, for some of you, 5 or 6 months. However, this new moon is technically conjunct Chiron here in that first house of self. So some of you might be really working with what some of you might be setting a new chapter that requires you to look at yourselves, because this is all happening in your first house of self. Maybe some of you, this initiating new chapter, this pile up in your first house of self, some of you might really be looking at self-development. Some of you might be really looking at sort of old wounds that you could be really releasing and letting go of in order to initiate this new chapter. So again, some of you might love this because you might love seeing the self-development, the ability to kind of work with Chiron wounded healer as you're initiating all of this in your first house of self. But some of you, it might feel a little challenging. It might feel a little uncomfortable where, as Mercury especially is applying to Saturn, where things might be getting a little bit more concrete, more logical, sort of moving away from that Neptune of idealism, fantasy, illusion, deception. So some of you might be getting really real and love it. And some of you might be getting really real and, coming back down to earth and having to get, clear on that Chiron and sort of looking at it in a way to say, all right, if I'm going to, initiate this new cycle and focus on these things that really support my health, support my work, my routines, my physical body, and sort of the work and the long-term goals that maybe feel more fulfilling, at some point we have to kind of get very real about the step-by-step process that's going to get me there. Instead of a more illusionary process. So again, take what resonates. Now, the next thing I want to get to is April 19th. And I think this is Sunday, April 19th, where the adjustments might start coming into play, because this is when Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will be at that 7-degree mark in your Aries first house of self. So again, reiterating, Mercury rules your 6th house of daily health and work routines. It rules your Gemini 3rd house of communication. Saturn merging your 10th house of career, public recognition, as well as your 11th house of long-term goals and social network. And Mars, your ruling planet, ruling your 1st house of self, your resources, your long-term financial themes, all kind of sitting here at the 7-degree mark, congealing, merging those areas in your 1st house of self. At that 7-degree mark is going to be quincunx, the south node, in your Virgo 6th house of daily work and or health routines. So the quincunx is the adjustment necessary between your 1st house of self and your 6th house of daily work and or health routines. So some of you might be, with Mercury ruling the 6th house as well, some of you might be really kind of, the quincunx is not, it's not a major aspect. It's sort of, it's happening in the background. So some of you might notice this in very subtle ways, but I think it's worth noting, especially after April 17th, where, we get to Sunday, and some of you might be contemplating, all right, what adjustments do I really need to make to my health, my work, my routines in order to really get this going? You know, what do I need to adjust that's going to not only support my physical body, but my work, my health in very real ways? And additionally, this is when Mars starts to separate from Saturn. So when Mars starts to separate from Saturn, it's sort of like some of you might be coming off of a little bit of that intensity when Mars was pushing up against Saturn. And some of you might get an additional dose of clarity around what adjustments are necessary. It's sort of like sometimes when planets are pushing up against another planet, you know, it's like the conversation is really happening. It's going. And sometimes when we walk away from a conversation, we get more clarity on what just happened. And so Sunday going into Monday, I kind of see that, where Mars starts to release and walk away from the conversation with Saturn and say, all right, you know, we pushed up, we mulled over a lot of ideas around, you know, your long-term financial goals, your resources, and sort of what's going on with career, long-term goals, even social network, and its impacts to you. And now Mars is kind of walking away from that conversation. And it's at this quincunx point with the South Node, at that point of release. So some of you might get an additional dose of subtle clarity around, okay, this is like another thing I need to adjust. I need to adjust my routine. I need to adjust my health, or I need to adjust my work, or all of it in order to start moving into this new chapter and this new cycle. So again, I want to reiterate, Uranus is at that anaretic degree in your second house of earned income and self-worth. So there could be some intensity around some financial matters, your value system, your self-worth that could also continue building. But as we get into next week, Uranus is going to make the final ingress out of your second house of earned income and self-worth, which might be very welcomed by many of you. So definitely stay tuned for your April monthly horoscope part 4, where I will go into Uranus's final ingress into your Gemini third house of communication, exchanging information, technology, transportation, siblings, extended family. Again, those people, places, and things within your everyday environment. Hi, Taurus Risings. So if you are listening and not watching, I am on Monday, April 13th, when Mars starts to separate, is separating from Neptune and applying to Saturn. So I've already touched on this last week in part 2, but to reiterate, Mars for the majority of this week will be pushing up, applying to Saturn, really integrating Saturnian themes in Taurus Rising's chart, which is going to be your Aquarius 10th house of career, public recognition, what feels fulfilling, and also the Capricorn 9th house of growth and potential. So this could include things like travel, publishing, teaching, spirituality, higher knowledge, continuing education. That could be career related for some of you as well. So with Mars applying to Saturn the majority of this week, those themes could intensify. But for you Taurus Risings, this is happening in the 12th house. So this might be more privately. This might be behind the scenes. Now, additionally, on, I think, April 14th. Yeah. So once we get to April 14th, that's when Mercury is going to be at 29 degrees in your Pisces 11th house of your social network, your long-term goals. And Mercury will be making that closing sextile at the anaretic 29 degree with Uranus in your first house of self. So this is that closing sextile, which theoretically could present sort of an opportunity. But Mercury rules this Gemini second house of earned income and self-worth. And Uranus is about to move into your Gemini second house of earned income and self-worth next week. So I think for a lot of Taurus risings, this closing sextile could bring up financial themes, value system, self-worth, and how it's sort of playing out with you personally, but also playing out with additional long-term goal themes in this closing sextile. That could be kind of this, for some of you, an intense sort of focus on, financial themes, self-worth, value system themes. That could be setting the stage for when Uranus makes its final ingress into the second house of earned income, self-worth later this month. So then we get to April, well, I think it's later on April 14th. Yeah. So late on April 14th, some of you definitely going into April 15th. That's when Mercury transitions off of that 29-degree mark in Pisces and enters your Aries 12th house of behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns. Definitely a more hidden, more private house. And Mercury will immediately start to apply to Neptune here. So I think individually, this could start really shifting Mercury-ruled areas. And as I've already mentioned, Mercury rules the second house of earned income, self-worth. So a lot of you could be kind of maybe shifting financial themes, financial budgets, surrendering, dissolving, sort of moving around the necessary things or necessary communication regarding your finances, your financial budgets, your self-worth, etc. Again, this is all happening behind the scenes for you, more privately. But Mercury also rules this Virgo 5th house of joy. So this can include your creativity, your self-expression, your children, if applicable to you. So some of you could also be dealing with sort of, children, family planning, what brings you joy, your creativity, your self-expression. So some of you, like your creativity and your self-expression, you could be kind of shifting the ideals around that, sort of how you communicate. Communication fields even. If you like work in communication fields, especially with Mars applying to that Saturn, which rules over your 10th house of career. So for some of you, like you might be shifting around your creativity, your artistry, your self-expression, sort of behind the scenes first. And for some of you, this might include children, themes involving children, child planning, kind of behind the scenes, with Mars also there ruling that 7th house of partnership as well. So that's a possibility for some of you if that's applicable. But, Mercury also ruling that financial house. A lot of you could be kind of shifting your ideals around your finances, your budgets. Maybe things have changed financially, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get to April 17th, which is a big day because we have so much going on. We have Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Chiron, the Sun and the Moon in a new moon phase, conjunct Chiron, all in your Aries 12th house of behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns. As I said, this is more of a private, kind of hidden area of your chart and thus lives. So definitely pay attention to your sleep, your dreams, what's going on mentally, what's playing out behind the scenes for you. Those are all things I would pay attention to. But let's break this down a little bit more. So at this point on April 17th, that Mercury is now separating from Neptune. and starting to apply to Saturn with Mars. So now on Friday, April 17th, Mercury and Mars are going to be pushing up against Saturn. Again, the planet that rules your career, your business, your public recognition, as well as those ninth house growth and potential themes, publishing, teaching, again, any growth and potential themes that could be career related for some of you, depending on your natal chart. And we also have this new moon conjunct Chiron. So first, breaking it down. Mercury and Mars applying to Saturn. This is where I think the Mercury-Mars themes could be merging regarding those Saturn rule themes. So I think a lot of you could be looking at, your finances as well as maybe a partner, because Mars rules seventh house of personal and professional partnerships. So some of you could be looking at professional partnerships, personal partnerships in the midst of this, and how it's playing into sort of your value, your finances, regarding your career, regarding growth and potential themes, maybe higher knowledge, continuing education, travel, etc. Some of you could also just be heavily focused on, or mentally focused on, your creativity, your self-expression, what really brings you joy and how it's mentally fulfilling to you, how it's mentally supporting the mental plan that some of you might be really focused on around this time regarding your career, overall growth and potential. So I think a lot of you, at a minimal level could really be heavily mentally focused on like, all right, what's the financial future? What's the growth and potential I want to focus on? Or the growth and potential that's part of the overall plan of action regarding what feels more fulfilling, or career, public recognition. So a lot of you could be really heavily mentally focused on those things around this time, or working with personal and or professional partnerships privately behind the scenes regarding those themes. Additionally, at the same time, this new moon is happening here in your 12th house. So some of you might really be gearing up to kind of start a new chapter mentally. What's transpiring around this time, whatever new chapter you're moving into, some of you might be setting sort of like a new mental platform that's going to support that. So some of you might really be, especially with Chiron in the midst of this new moon, some of you might be sort of working with that wounded healer, like some of you might be working with like the mental thought patterns that aren't going to really support you moving into this new chapter mentally. So I think a lot, generally speaking, a lot of Taurus risings, like you might be working with things mentally behind the scenes or just really privately with personal and or professional partnerships, that it's sort of like maybe you're creating a new mental platform to move into this new chapter. So when we get to April 19th, I think that's an additional day. So Sunday, April 19th is an additional day this month where adjustments can be made. And the reason why I say this is because that Sunday, April 19th is when Mars is going to start to separate from Saturn, again, ruling the career, the public recognition, the growth and potential. And so it's sort of like Mars is starting to walk away from that conversation with Saturn. And if you notice on this day, Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will be sitting at the 7-degree mark, quincunx the south node in your 5th house of joy. So again, the 5th house could include children if applicable, creativity, self-expression, whatever brings you joy. And so with Mars kind of walking away from the conversation, but Mercury, Saturn, and Mars sitting at the 7-degree mark, sort of like, have you ever been in a conversation, we'll say with Mars and Saturn, an intense conversation, and then you walk away from that conversation and you start to gain clarity around what really happened? I think Sunday going into Monday, it's subtle. Again, a quincunx isn't a major aspect, but I think there could be this subtle point of like that intensity with Mars and Saturn starts to kind of dissipate, starts to walk away. Sunday going into Monday and moving on. And Mercury is in a deeper conversation with Saturn where things get a lot more logical, a lot more logistical. And with it being quincunx, the south node, it's sort of like the time where you can make any minor adjustment to support where you're moving forward at this point. Again, Mercury rules the area that Uranus is about to move into that second house of earned income and self-worth. So this could involve more like, now that these planets have walked away from Neptune, like less illusion, less deception, less sort of like, what's ideal? How do we make the ideal realistic, concrete, tangible? And this is the point where I think a lot of Taurus risings, you could be making adjustments kind of behind the scenes with, your connections with others, your career, growth and potential, financial themes. And the quincunx to the south node in the 5th house, making adjustments to what maybe feels a little bit more joyful for you, making adjustments to, the creativity, the self-expression, if that's applicable or resonates around this time, so that you can kind of continue moving into something that's more tangible, more real, so that when Uranus finally makes its final ingress into your Gemini 2nd house, going into next week for roughly the next 7 years, this is where things could really start to innovate and change regarding your finances, your value system, and your self-worth. So this week you could be really initiating those new cycles, getting more grounded behind the scenes. Maybe some of you, this will be just really like mentally stepping into a new chapter where you can prepare yourselves for the next phase of Uranus moving into that Gemini 2nd house for roughly the next 7 years, starting next week, which I will get to in part 4 of your April monthly horoscope regarding your finances, your value system, and your self-worth. So definitely stay tuned for that. Hi, Gemini Risings. So if you're listening and not watching, I am on Monday, April 13th, when Mars is officially separating from Neptune and pushing up and applying to Saturn for really the majority of this week. So reiterating a little bit on what I touched on last week with Mars and Saturn, this could feel quite intense for a lot of us. But for you Gemini risings, this is happening in your Aries 11th house of friends, groups, communities, long-term goals. So this could be sort of playing out in those areas. But Saturn rules your Capricorn 8th house of long-term finances. So investments, assets, debt, loans, taxes, resources, partners' resources, if applicable. And so a lot of you could be, with Mars pushing up against Saturn, really kind of pushing for, even in intense ways, a new chapter, a new plan of action regarding those long-term financial goals, management, resources, etc. Now, another possibility with this, because Saturn also rules your Aquarius 9th house, is Mars could be pushing up or intensifying the Aquarius 9th house themes, which is going to include those growth and potential themes. So teaching, publishing, higher knowledge, continuing education, travel, spirituality, And again, especially if your midheaven is in this area, or you have natal placements in your Aquarius ninth house, this could really amplify even career themes as well, regarding those growth and potential themes that I mentioned or didn't even mention. What is growth and potential to you personally? And how is Mars pushing up against that, intensifying that, and trying to integrate that into a new chapter that can play out over the next couple years regarding those themes? So again, some of you, this might be more financial and making decisions around that. And some of you, this might be more sort of, growth and potential related and pushing into a new plan of action regarding that, solidifying that, committing to that. And additionally, we have definitely when we get to Tuesday, April 14th, that's when Mercury will be predominantly sitting at 29 degrees in your Pisces 10th house of career, business, public recognition. Sextile Uranus at 29 degrees in your Taurus 12th house of behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns. Now, the sextile is an opportunity you have to take, typically, theoretically. So some of you could see sort of like maybe subconsciously or maybe something behind the scenes. Mercury in Pisces is kind of, communicating in a multidimensional way. And Mercury rules your first house of self, the physical body. So this could involve you personally, but some of you could really be seeing sort of like some last minute opportunity. Again, this is a closing sextile, or something could be sort of happening maybe behind the scenes with career, public recognition. Now, Mercury also rules your Virgo 4th house of home, family, property, and real estate. So this could also involve something regarding sort of home, family, property, real estate behind the scenes. And I think it's important to pay attention to what's happening with you personally, or what's happening with home, family, property, real estate themes around this time. Because later on April 14th, definitely by April 15th, that Mercury that rules the home, family, property, real estate, and you shifts into Aries, into that 11th house of long-term goals, personal and professional social networks. So whatever comes up around those themes, how is it playing into sort of a total shift in energy regarding those areas and your long-term goals that could just involve you personally, but could also involve sort of the emotional and physical foundation, as some of you might be really focused on, and how it's shifting into an entirely new energy literally hours later regarding your long-term goals, things playing out with personal and professional social networks, and how that Mercury is now pushing up against Neptune. And so this changes things. A lot of you, with what's come up at this point, could be really shifting yourselves, right? Mercury rules your physical body, how you take independent action. So some of you might be sort of dissolving, surrendering, releasing something that no longer supports like the independent action you want to take, how you want to feel, how you want to move through the world, and its impacts to sort of the emotional and physical foundation you may need, how it's also playing out among your social network, who you want to surround yourselves with that supports sort of this new ideal that you want to step into regarding yourselves, how you want to move through the world, or what's playing out with your personal and or professional social network that could be shifting around or moving, that could create new potential outcomes to a living situation, the emotional and physical foundation some of you need. So I think a lot of Gemini risings at this point could really be moving into a time of sort of dissolving or surrendering sort of, who you want to surround yourselves with, the emotional and physical foundation that's going to support you, that could involve as minor as, renovations or, moving, organizing the house, whatever it is, to really kind of create an environment that fully supports you, So a lot of you could really be looking at and shifting, even creating new ideals around your long-term goals, who you want to surround yourselves with. But it could simultaneously start to create new outcomes to maybe the foundation you need for that, or what needs to change or shift with you personally. Then when we get to April 17th, things continue intensifying. So Friday, April 17th, this is when we have the full Monty, the full pile up here in Aries. We will have Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Chiron, the sun, the moon in a new moon in your Aries 11th house of long-term goals, dreams, aspirations, personal and professional social networks, so friends, groups, communities, those kinds of things. So lots going on here. And this is a very visible area of your chart. So a lot of Gemini risings, you could see external events really be playing out. This isn't maybe less, it could be internal. But I think where it's playing out, you could really kind of like see the movement externally in your lives. So let's break this day down a little bit. At this juncture, we have Mercury now separated from Neptune. So you've kind of gone through what I just discussed with Mercury pushing up against Neptune and those potentials there. Now we have Mercury and Mars pushing up against Saturn. This changes things. This shifts the energy a little bit because whatever's happened thus far, Mercury ruling you personally, as well as your 4th house of home, family, property, real estate, or that emotional, physical foundation you need, is now pushing up against Saturn. Where are things getting very real, tangible, right? Saturn likes longevity, commitment. Saturn likes the tangible. And so this could be the shift of, all right, of mold over this stuff with Neptune. And Mercury starts pushing up with Mars against Saturn to say, what physical changes, what tangible physical changes, commitment, longevity do you want to make to those Saturn-ruled areas now that you've maybe mulled over the new ideal around you, how you want to move through the world, or the new ideals around, the physical and or emotional foundation you need. Now things get very real, and you could be looking at, all right, well, this is who I am. This is what I want to focus on with me. This is the foundation I want, I need. Now with Mercury pushing up against Saturn, things not only get logical, but you could really start to focus more on getting tangible, logical, creating more commitment and longevity to those Saturn-ruled areas, which is going to be the Capricorn 8th house of those long-term financial goals, investments, assets, debt, loans, partners' resources, even creating mutual empowerment. Maybe mutual empowerment with people you live with financial themes. Again, sky's the limit there with financial themes. And the other Saturn-ruled area, getting logical, getting more tangible, committed, creating longevity around that growth and potential, your spirituality, your faith, your knowledge, publishing, teaching. Again, that could be career related for some of you. And how it's playing out and being infused and integrated with the long-term goals and the people you need to surround yourselves with. So this is where things could get intense, but in a very real, concrete way. Once Mercury, Mars, and Saturn have all kind of moved beyond the veil of Neptune. And then when we get to, before I move on, there's just so much happening in April. So still sticking with Friday, April 17th. As this Mercury and Mars is pushing up against Saturn that I just discussed, this new moon is forming in this Aries 11th house of friends, groups, communities, long-term goals. And so this is an additional layer of creating a new chapter. Again, this isn't a cardinal sign. Cardinal signs are initiators. And so initiating a new chapter, initiating the seeds that need to be planted around your personal and professional social networks, your long-term goals that are maybe playing into the financial themes, the growth and potential themes, what's really going to support you physically and how you want to move through the world, and maybe looking at sort of home, family, property, real estate themes as to, that foundation that's going to support all of those things. And so this new moon comes along and is like, all right, let's initiate this new chapter. Let's get this going to really unfold over the next 5 or 6 months. But it's conjunct Chiron, the wounded healer. And so maybe this is bittersweet for you. Maybe there's something that, maybe it's interesting. Like when I look at this, there's like the logical, but there's also the intuitive that comes through for Gemini risings, where some of you, again, going back to that like bittersweet, where there could be opportunities, there could be these new chapters and new cycles. And maybe some of you have predicted or known or have prepared to kind of move into this new chapter, but it's bittersweet. Like there's the wounded healer aspect where Chiron was this incredible healer for everyone else, but, suffered himself. And I think this could be a moment where Gemini risings, it's like you're maybe stepping into like incredible new chapters around long-term goals and dreams and aspirations, and really getting clear on the logistics and concrete foundation necessary to support you, to support all these other areas. But there could be something a little crunchy about it for some of you, where you're like, wow, it's here. Especially because Saturn has, moved out of that Pisces 10th house of career, business, public recognition, what brings you fulfillment, really tested and challenged you in that area, but also created major changes to your identity, how you move through the world, your partnerships, how you connect with people, your home, your family, your property, your real estate. And you've come off of that. So I think from like a bird's eye view perspective, there's so many like opportunities here, I think, for a lot of Gemini risings. But with this new moon Chiron in the 11th house of like, all right, now this is the long-term goal. After what I've built, what I've worked so hard for. But, it might require even some of you to kind of like let go of something to initiate this new chapter. So once we get to April 19th, I think that will be the next point of potential adjustment. It's subtle because at this point on Sunday, April 19th, Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will all be sitting at that 7-degree mark together. Quincunx, the South Node. And so the quincunx it's not a major aspect, but it's an adjustment, even an uncomfortable adjustment. It's sort of like that. It's not the major thing in the room, but it's kind of like that nagging, annoying sound that like no one else can really hear, but only you can hear kind of feeling. And so again, this could be very subtle with the quincunx, the adjustment. But I want to point out the detail of this day, because as the quincunx sort of starts to really take form, Mars is starting to separate from Saturn. So Mars is walking away from the conversation with Saturn that I think really intensified this week for a lot of us. And it's like, if you've ever been in a really intense conversation and then you walk away and then you gain more clarity on what just happened, Sunday, April 19th, going into Monday, this is where like Mars is walking away, and that sort of like intensity, desire, motivation, plan of action can like start to kind of like, it's still there, but it's like, oh, okay, you know, it's happened. We've had a conversation. And the quincunx to the south node in your Virgo fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate. Sort of like maybe it's very subtle, but maybe there's additional clarity that comes through as Mars is starting to separate. And Mercury is starting to get really close to Saturn, where Mars is starting to separate, kind of dissipate that intensity, that action, that desire. And Mercury is now really pushing up in that conversation with Saturn, where things get very real. Maybe some of you get really real. You're focusing on logic, you know, what's the conversation, what's the data on, initiating this new cycle around what I want to commit to. Maybe some of you are really stating and communicating what you want to commit to around what supports the long-term goals, the foundation of your lives, you personally. And this could be the point where it opens up an opportunity for some of you to make that uncomfortable adjustment to maybe a living situation, people you live with, property, real estate. Some of you could be making that adjustment by maybe looking at your living situation or your home and just saying like, well, in order for me to feel supported in this new chapter, in this new thing that I'm focused on, what needs to change at home, or what needs to change with, what's going to support you emotionally, physically, foundationally. So some of you could be really looking at that. And just because it's an uncomfortable adjustment doesn't mean it's not going to be a positive thing. There's a lot of Gemini risings that I know personally where I can see this being an adjustment, but it's the opportunity to make the adjustment to step into a more positive foundational future that supports the long-term goals, supports them, supports the career, the growth and potential, the long-term financial future. So again, what I also want to point out at this point is this could also be helping a lot of Gemini risings make the necessary changes and step into those new foundational chapters for Uranus making its final ingress into that Mercury ruled area. So again, we have Mercury, Saturn, and Mars up here. So Mercury's pushing up against Saturn, getting real, getting concrete, getting clear communication, even fiery communication, because it's in Aries, making those adjustments necessary to step into new chapters around the long-term goals, the dreams, the aspirations, the people you really want to surround yourselves with. That, again, Mercury making a quincunx to another Mercury ruled area, your fourth house, that foundational area, could be gearing up and helping Uranus, which is going to make its final ingress into the other Mercury ruled area, which is your first house of self, physical body, how you take independent action. When Mercury is going to make that final ingress next week, which I will break down in your April monthly horoscope part 4. So stay tuned for that. Hi, Cancer risings. So I am on a Monday, April 13th, when Mars is officially separating from Neptune and pushing up and applying to Saturn in your Aries 10th house of career, business, public recognition, or what brings you fulfillment. So just touching a little bit more on what I already touched on last week in part 2. Mars applying to Saturn, what's shifting around your desires, your motivation, your plan of action regarding Saturn ruled areas, which for you, Cancer rising, is your Capricorn 7th house of personal and professional partnerships, as well as your Aquarius 8th house of those long-term financial themes, investments, assets, debt, loans, partners, resources, if applicable, So some of you could be really focused on the plan of action, playing out with personal and professional partnerships, financial themes, making big decisions, where this is happening in the 10th house of career, business, public recognition. So some of you could be really focused on the partnership arena, the financial arena, and sort of how it's playing out regarding sort of new chapters, new commitments with career, business, public recognition, or what brings you fulfillment themes. And then when we get to April 14th, that's when Mercury's predominantly going to be at that 29 degrees of Pisces, so that anaretic degree, forming that exact sextile to Uranus in your Taurus 11th house of friends, groups, communities, and long-term goals. So Mercury making that closing sextile to Uranus, that is the anaretic degree. Some of you could have a sense of urgency, more intensity regarding your overall growth and potential, your long-term goals, maybe what's playing out with your social network. That might be playing into, what's going on with your business, your career, your public recognition. But again, Mercury rules this Gemini 12th house of behind the scenes, what's sort of happening in private, mental thought patterns, as well as Mercury ruling this Virgo 3rd house of communication, exchanging information. So some of you could be really feeling the intensity around maybe, what's going on behind the scenes, your mental thought patterns, what's going on with conversations, communication, exchanging information. That's involving what's playing out with growth and potential, long-term goals that could involve, your higher knowledge, your faith, your spirituality, publishing, teaching, travel. So again, focus on, pay attention to what could be sort of intensifying around this time, because once we get into really like very late April 14th, certainly by Wednesday, April 15th, that's when that Mercury moves into Aries and things shift. So like Tuesday to Wednesday with what intensifies, what sort of opportunities, whether it's behind the scenes, more mental, more physical, for some of you that could come up. Wednesday, it shifts. Mercury moves from water into fire, and Mercury is moving into that Aries fire 10th house of career, business, public recognition. So you could feel that shift in sort of communication, exchanging information, what's going on in your everyday environment versus what's going on mentally. And that shift in those types of themes, moving into your career, your business, your public recognition, what brings you fulfillment. But Mercury will immediately start applying to Neptune on Wednesday, April 15th. And this shifts things a little bit. So some of you could be shifting your mental thought patterns, what you've been working on behind the scenes, like shifting your ideals, dissolving, surrendering things around those themes, and their impact to sort of your career, your public recognition. Mercury ruling your Virgo 3rd house, this could also start to shift the ideals or surrender and dissolve things regarding communication, technology, transportation, which again, I think could be heavily professional for a lot of Cancer risings, especially if you work in communication, technology, transportation fields. This is where things could, like some of you could really be shifting your ideals around those things if you work in those areas. But I think on a personal level, some of you could be kind of dissolving or shifting your ideals around, your personal communication, how, you exchange information, etc. Now, there's one detail I do want to mention. If you do know your natal chart and your IC is in your Virgo third house, that IC is that specific angle that represents the home, family, property, real estate themes. So some of you, with this Mercury applying to Neptune, some of you could be shifting your ideals around your living environment. Relationships with people you live with, family, property, real estate, and sort of its impacts to your career, your business, what feels fulfilling to you. So some of you could be still working with that emotional, physical foundation of your lives and sort of kind of like shifting the ideals, the boundaries, maybe dissolving and surrendering what no longer works with that to then further support the career, the business, the public recognition, especially when we get to April 17th is the next day I have. So when we get to April 17th, this is when the solidification of what just happened, I think, could really take form. So again, what shifted and dissolved with Mercury applying to Neptune that now, when we get to Friday, April 17th, Mercury and Mars are going to be applying to Saturn, where maybe you dissolved, you surrendered, you shifted some things around that now at this juncture, it's pushing up against Saturn. And I think Saturn's saying, what's logical? What do you want to really build, commit to, create longevity around based off of, what you sat with recently, kind of shifting, dissolving, surrendering those Mercury ruled areas that I mentioned. And Mars is in the mix too. So there's still this the plan of action, the desire, the motivation playing into it as well. And there's also this new moon taking shape here at 27 degrees in that Aries 10th house of career, business, public recognition. So it's sort of like whatever Mercury, Mars, and Saturn are really kind of intensifying, pushing to build, commit to, create longevity around. This new moon comes along and creates an additional layer of let's initiate this new chapter. Let's plant these seeds. Let's get this thing going. However, this new moon is conjunct Chiron. So Chiron's the wounded healer. And so for some of you, there could be, something that feels a little emotional. Maybe something feels a little challenging. So some of you, it could be, maybe bittersweet. Maybe you're moving things into a new direction that is clear, is the right path. But, Chiron's involved in this new chapter for, a lot of us. And so there could be this sense of, nostalgia or just like, some of you might be looking back to how far you've come and you might be moving into something new or ready to kind of build a new legacy, build something new over the next couple years with Mercury and Mars pushing up against Saturn. And it could just feel, a little Chiron-like. So, and then some of you with Chiron, some of you love Chiron. And this could feel good in the way of like, maybe some of you are ready to initiate this chapter. You're ready to kind of let go. You're ready to move into something new. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. But when we get to April 19th, this day jumped out at me because this is when Mercury, Mars, and Saturn will be sitting at the 7-degree mark in your Aries 10th house of career, business, public recognition, or what brings you fulfillment. So, Mercury, what it rules in your chart, really kind of this Mercury, Mars, and Saturn what they rule in your chart is sort of merging at this point on Sunday, April 19th. Your thought patterns, your communication, your creativity, what brings you joy, your career, your business, your public recognition, who you want to connect with, your partnerships, your financial resources, all congealing in this very visible area of your chart and thus lives. But at the 7-degree mark, it's quincunx, the South Node, in your Virgo third house of communication, exchanging information. So the third house can also be sort of like errands, paperwork, appointments, phone calls. So it could be, the communication, exchanging information, the technology, the short distance travel, the siblings, the extended family. For some of you, it could be home, family, property, and real estate if your IC is in the Virgo third house. So this is where all those themes kind of merge and come together. And some of you could be making that adjustment to your everyday lives and what's necessary to make that adjustment to then support what could be going on or what needs to happen with the career, the business, the public recognition, sort of new chapters, new adjustments, etc. So a lot happening here that for some Cancer risings could also cause like additional action and tangible changes to your first house of self and your 7th house of personal and professional partnerships. So some of you could be making additional changes depending on your natal chart. Now, with Mercury at the 7-degree mark with Mars and Saturn that are exact, and Mars is starting to separate from Saturn on Sunday, April 19th. With Mercury making a quincunx, or that adjustment to the South Node in Virgo, which is a Mercury ruled area, I think could be that subtle adjustment that is preparing Cancer risings for Uranus's final ingress into the other Mercury ruled area, which is your Gemini 12th house of subconscious thought patterns, behind the scenes. So some of you could be sort of making that adjustment to further support Uranus's final ingress into this 12th house, where a lot of you for roughly the next 7 years could go through like, it's very interesting because, I think the 12th house gets a bad reputation, but like working with people one-on-one, Uranus going through the 12th house, like people go through like major awakenings. They go through like big spiritual awakenings. Like their subconscious sort of like comes more outward. It really, really interesting stuff happens here. And I think with the other aspects to Uranus and Gemini that are happening this year moving forward, that could like further amplify that. So I think there's definitely some new cycles, new things starting here regarding career, business, public recognition, what brings you fulfillment, that might be playing into sort of that not only adjustment, but kind of shift with Uranus moving out of the 11th house of long-term goals, social network, where things might become, that shift to more of your inner world, your private world. But we'll get to that next week when I talk more about the Uranus ingress, final ingress into Gemini, and, being there for roughly the next 7 years. But I think for a lot of Cancer risings, deeper into April, there's just so many incredible things happening in your 10th house of career, business, public recognition. A lot of these transits, especially with, regarding Neptune here, will happen. This was once in a lifetime. So many things starting to initiate, especially in a cardinal sign where cardinal signs like to initiate. So a lot happening here in this very visible area of your chart and thus lives, with, new cycles, new chapters, with a little bit of an adjustment and gearing up for that final ingress of Uranus into this 12th house, which I will get to in part 4. So definitely stay tuned for that next week. Hey, Leo Risings. So I am on Monday, April 13th. That is when Mars starts to officially separate from Neptune and push up, apply to that Saturn happening in your Aries 9th house. So higher knowledge, spirituality, continuing education, long distance travel, publishing, teaching, growth and potential themes that could be career related. So yes, this is happening in this area, but Mars will be applying to Saturn for the majority of this week. And Mars also rules your Scorpio 4th house of home, family, property, and real estate. So think about like the emotional, physical foundation, themes within that could be really playing a part in what you want to solidify, commit to, create longevity around. So some of you might be looking at sort of the emotional and physical foundation you need to really create sort of new chapters and new cycles regarding your work, your health, who you connect with, personal and professional partnerships, and how that's playing into your overall growth and potential. So once we get to April 14th, that is when, for the majority of April 14th, that's when Mercury will be at that 29-degree mark, that anaretic degree, sense of urgency, sextile, that closing sextile to Uranus at 29 degrees in your Taurus 10th house of career, public recognition, what feels fulfilling. So this closing sextile could definitely integrate long-term goals, who you want to surround yourselves with, as well as financial themes because of what Mercury rules in your chart and how it's sort of playing into an opportunity or the desire to create more value to the career, the business, the public recognition, what brings you fulfillment. But again, this sextile is happening at 29 degrees, so it could feel intense. There could be a sense of urgency around that, or a sense of urgency around those themes and how it's sort of playing out with finances, career, public recognition, etc. Then later, late on April 14th, certainly as we get into Wednesday, April 15th, that is when Mercury officially enters your Aries 9th house of those growth and potential themes I mentioned, which could be career related for some of you. This is when the energy shifts. Mercury just went from its place of detriment, technically fall, where it was in water. Now it gains strength going into Aries from Pisces, but it's going from water to fire. So I think this is where, whatever happened earlier in the week, Monday, Tuesday, with that sextile to Uranus happening in water and earth, now Mercury moves into that fire and changes the energy around, the long-term goals, the social network, the finances, the self-worth with what Mercury rules. But Mercury immediately starts to apply to Neptune. And so this could be the shift that starts to create changes to your ideal financial world, ideal social network, sort of shifting, dissolving, surrendering, what doesn't support the long-term goals, your value system regarding all this new energy, new chapters really initiating around your growth and potential. So it's an interesting season, I think, for Leo risings, because I think this might start to feel good for a lot of Leo risings, happening in fire, trying your first house of self and the physical body. But there's this sort of initial, I think, shift around your value system, your self-worth, your long-term goals, your social network that could be happening around this time that could also be helping gear up Uranus, which is going to move into that Gemini 11th house of your social network for the next 7 years. So this could be the point where you're like, what do I really want to change, shift around, dissolve, surrender? So that when Uranus moves into that Mercury ruled area of your social network and your long-term goals, you've kind of mulled over where you want it to go, if that makes sense. Then when we get to April 17th, wild day. So April 17th, Friday, we have Mercury now separating from Neptune. So that cycle, that situation I just talked about is starting to move on. That conversation, Mercury's starting to walk away from that conversation. But now we have Mercury and Mars pushing up against Saturn. So this is where I think the shift around your personal or professional social network, your long-term goals, your value system, your finances, you've kind of mulled over or shifted some things around there, that now Mercury pushing up against Saturn could have you focusing on the work and or health routines that are going to support that long-term goal, support the value system, support the social network, as well as with Saturn ruling this Aquarius 7th house of personal and professional partnerships. Some of you could be getting very clear, very realistic about the personal and professional partnerships that also support your value system, your self-worth, your social network, your long-term goals, playing into the overall growth and potential. Additionally, on April 17th, there will be this new moon at 27 degrees. I think adding an additional layer of really helping initiate this new chapter around maybe finances, long-term goals, social network. Also with Mars being in the midst of this, Mars ruling your 4th house of home, family, property, and real estate, helping kind of solidify and initiate the emotional and physical foundation necessary to support the bigger picture here playing out. But this new moon is technically conjunct Chiron. And I think some of us are going to love this and some of us are going to feel uncomfortable with this. But whether it's good, bad, or in between, this new moon, really initiating this new chapter with all these new cycles. There's a lot of layers here from my perspective of new chapter, new cycle, new story. With that new moon conjunct Chiron, it's sort of like, some of you could have really been waiting for this moment, but it might feel, it's sort of like the image that I'm trying to communicate is, have you ever been so excited and ready about something, really initiating something, kind of getting out of a certain chapter in your lives, that when it happens and it shows up on your doorstep, you're like, oh, and okay, here we are. Like it's happening. And then you're so used to being in that old chapter, stepping into the new chapter, although it feels good, like it might require a transition period. Or some of you might be really, with Chiron being the wounded healer, like some of you might be initiating these new cycles and new chapters, as I mentioned, but there might be like a Chiron aspect to it of like, what needs to, like some of you might be working with, like seeing how old wounds have really deeply affected you, especially in the past couple years with all the Pisces crap in the 8th house. So it could really present itself, I think, in such a variety of ways. But I think with it being what I want to point out, okay, the past couple years, so much was going on in your Pisces eighth house, which is averse to the first house of self. You couldn't see it. Now, all this in Aries, it's trying your first house. You can see it and it's flowing. So this is the point where I think where like previously you couldn't see it, now you can see it, and you're like, oh, now I see it. Now I know what I need to do. Now it's all, for some of you, it could be like, now it's all making sense. And it's playing into or helping you step into a new chapter that's more clear, especially with Mercury pushing up against Saturn, which can be very logical, very kind of concrete situation going on here. Very real. Mercury Saturn is real. And again, that could be playing into that new chapter. But closing out this week on April 19th, this day jumped out at me because this is when Mercury, Mars, and Saturn will be sitting at 7 degrees together. And this is sort of where Mercury, Mars, and Saturn, what they rule in your chart, what houses they rule, is sort of merging and congealing your income, your long-term goals, your social network, your personal and professional partnerships, the emotional and physical foundation, all coming together regarding your overall growth and potential. But with Mercury, Mars, and Saturn all sitting here at the 7 degree mark, it's quincunx, the south node, at 7 degrees in your second house of earned income and self-worth. So that's an adjustment. And so this could be the point on, come Sunday. Again, the quincunx is not a major aspect, it's more subtle. And so a lot of you could be feeling this in a subtle way around like a subtle adjustment, especially with Mars starting to walk away from the conversation on Sunday, April 19th, where Mars pushing up against Saturn can feel quite intense, especially with Mars in rulership. Now Mars is walking away from the conversation later on Sunday, leaving Mercury and Saturn to it. And I think this is where I think a lot of Leo risings at this point are going to be initiating these new chapters, ready to go. It's visible to you. You can see it. I think this could be really good in a lot of ways. But I think some Leo risings with the quincunx of the south node in the second house, like you could be with Mercury ruling this second house, making a quincunx to the second house, applying to Saturn. Some of you could be making adjustments in really real, authentic, tangible ways around your value system, your self-worth, your earned income. So a lot of Leo risings, like you could be on fire and like really stepping out of a phase or any phase of like, maybe this, maybe that. I think a lot of Leo risings this week are going to be stepping into a chapter where you're getting very real. And it's sort of like not just getting real, but saying like, I don't want this to be an idea anymore. I don't want this to be a potential anymore. What am I going to do? What adjustments am I going to make so that it actually becomes a tangible reality around the people I want to surround myself with, my long-term goals, my finances, my value systems, etc. And I think Mercury applying to Saturn being very real, very tangible. The quincunx to that Mercury ruled area with the South Node, making adjustments to release what no longer works, what you're no longer going to take with you in this new phase of life. But I think the Mercury quincunx, the Mercury Saturn at this point on Sunday could also be helping some Leo risings prepare for Uranus to move into the other Mercury ruled area next week on April 26th to make those adjustments, create these new cycles. But I think with Mercury also ruling the area that Uranus is about to move into regarding your friends, your groups, your communities, your long-term goals, this could also be setting the stage and preparing that Uranus to transition into that change and innovation a lot of Leo risings are stepping into for roughly the next 7 years regarding your dreams, your aspirations, your long-term goals, and your social network. So definitely stay tuned for part 4 where I will break more of that down. Hello, Virgo risings. All right. So I am on Monday, April 13th, when Mars officially separated from Neptune, and now really for the majority of this week is applying and pushing up against Saturn. And this is happening in your Aries 8th house of transformation, even including sort of big decisions. But the 8th house, is a financial house. It's those long-term financial themes, management, so investment, assets, debt, loans, partners, resources, if applicable. And so going into this week, there could be a lot playing out in that arena of, making big decisions about certain things, focusing on, finances, resources, etc. Particularly pertaining to, for some of you, particularly pertaining to a health situation, a work situation, because Saturn rules your 6th house of daily work and or health routines. So some of you could be kind of, something could be intensifying around a plan of action, a desire, a motivation around a health situation, wellness, vitality, or it could be, a work situation and its impacts to those routines. Now, Saturn also rules your Capricorn 5th house. This is the 5th house of joy, which could include creativity, artistry, self-expression, children, if applicable to you. So some of you could be initiating sort of a new chapter, a new plan of action around family planning, children, etc. But some of you who are artists, creatives, could also be kind of looking at like the resources, the investments for those projects as well. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. But this could definitely be, again, intensifying either sort of like a work health situation or some of those 5th house themes, or both, honestly. So once we get to Tuesday, April 14th, this is when Mercury is going to be sitting at that 29-degree mark, that aneretic degree, again, a sense of urgency. And this Mercury at the 29-degree mark is going to be in your Pisces 7th house of personal and or professional partnerships, making that closing sextile to Uranus at that 29th degree in your Taurus 9th house of, higher knowledge, spirituality, long distance travel, publishing, teaching, could be career related. So, I like to think of it as like the 9th house of growth and potential. So some of you could be kind of intensely focused on taking an opportunity or creating more value that could be creating new outcomes to your career, your public recognition based off of what's going on with personal and professional partnerships, growth and potential themes. But some of you could also be trying to sort of seek new opportunities, or create more value with the sextile aspect to the other Mercury ruled area, which is going to be your first house of the physical body, the self, how you take independent action. So some of you, this could be more like, career growth and potential related. So it could be tying to Saturn ruling your sixth house of work. But some of you, this could be sort of like your physical body. Again, with Saturn also ruling the sixth house where your health lies as well. So I think some of you, this could be like a work related situation, some last minute opportunity to create more growth and potential before Uranus starts moving into that Gemini 10th house of career, business, and public recognition for roughly the next 7 years. Really shaking things up, creating some innovation, some change, etc., which I'll get more into next week with part 4. But I think this could be an additional kind of last closing sextile opportunity regarding those situations to kind of prepare for what could be kind of shifting or changing over the next 7 years, where a lot of you could be really innovating sort of what you do, your public recognition, your career, and what feels fulfilling. So regardless of what is happening, again, take what resonates, but the first couple days in this week, again, like Monday, Tuesday, when Mercury's at that anaretic degree, just be aware of what is playing out, because later on April 14th, certainly by the time we get into Wednesday, April 15th, for many of us, Mercury is going to shift into your Aries 8th house. So again, I want to reiterate, Mercury goes to that anaretic degree, creates that closing sextile to Uranus, and then moves into Aries. So it's sort of like Mercury is moving from water and going into fire. And I think a lot of you could really start to feel that shift, especially because Mercury rules your first house of the physical body. So some of you could really kind of feel that change in energy once you get into Wednesday, April 15th, especially because once Mercury enters that fire sign, that Aries 8th house of transformation, big decisions, long-term financial themes, resources, Mercury is going to be applying to Neptune immediately for the next couple days. And so with Mercury ruling you and your 10th house of career, public recognition, what feels fulfilling, I think some of you could be making big decisions with this happening in the 8th house. Some of you could be looking at financial management, financial themes, resources that could be playing a part in maybe making some shifts, changes regarding your career, what really is going to support you, your independent action. So I think some of you could be making decisions or looking at like finances regarding sort of the career, your public recognition, what really supports you, your ability to take independent action. But in the way you could be doing it with Neptune involved is sort of like, dissolving, surrendering, kind of like shifting things around a bit before you make the full commitment to what it is you really want. Because once we get to April 17th, this is when that Mercury is going to start to separate, or is separating from Neptune, moving away from that potential phase of like, what is the right decision? What's my ideal financial future regarding the career, or what really supports me, my physical body. Then we get to April 17th. That Mercury starts to separate from that Neptune and applies to Saturn with Mars. Now things get very real. So I think this could be the shift in the week, Friday, April 17th, where some of you maybe start to really consider the right decision. Mercury, especially Mercury applying to Saturn, what's logical what is, what's the logical, data-driven decisions regarding where you want to take career, financial goals, resources. And with Mars still involved here, again, Mars also rules your Scorpio third house of communication, exchanging information. So with Mercury, the planet of communication, also involving itself with the ruler of your third house of communication, I think a lot of you could be sort of like communicating big decisions, communicating financial themes, transformational work that could be impacting you personally, like your personal physical body, how you want to move through the world, or more professionally through career, business, public recognition. Whatever it is, I think this is where things become more real as Mercury, Mars, and Saturn have now separated from Neptune. Like you've kind of maybe mulled over all the potentials and all the ideals, but now this is where I think a lot of Virgo risings are starting to get real with whatever's transpiring around this time. And additionally, on April 17th, there will be a new moon at 27 degrees. And this is sort of another indicator to me looking at this as to what is initiating. This is another layer of a new chapter where Mercury and Mars are pushing up against Saturn to create this new chapter, this new cycle that can play out roughly over the next couple years. Through the communication that's impacting you, impacting maybe career, public recognition for some of you, that could involve finances or big decisions, and how that might be playing into your ability to step into this new chapter that initially can really start to play out over the next 5 or 6 months as an initial sort of checkpoint. But Mars takes about 2.5 years to make a full lap. So these sort of new cycles could be playing out over the next couple of years with Mercury and Mars. But you could kind of step into this new chapter to say, like, let's make these decisions, see what plays out over the next 5 or 6 months, and then see where we're at. So this new moon is technically conjunct Chiron. So some of you, it might feel, Chiron's the wounded healer. So this could feel a little weird, a little, especially in the 8th house. The 8th house is where fears lie. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. But, if I see it, I say it. Maybe some of you, there's like anxiety or fear with what's going on, or there's anxiety or fear around this new chapter, even if it feels logical, it feels grounded, it feels, even right for some of you. That Chiron is there in that 8th house, which, again, is technically the house where fears would land. What is that fear showing you? Is it in the driver's seat? If it is in the driver's seat, it needs to not be in the driver's seat around this time. But, some of you might be working with that. And then, some of you love Chiron. You love Chiron. So some of you might be really ready to step into this, really ready to step into this energy. And, ready to step into what Chiron is here to show you with stepping into this potential new chapter that could be playing out with sort of like resources, financial themes, making big decisions. That again, I think could be gearing up a lot of Virgo risings with Mercury involved regarding Uranus making its final ingress into that other Mercury ruled area, which is your career, your business, your public recognition, what brings you fulfillment. So a lot of this could feel new. It could even feel exciting for some Virgo risings as you're gearing up to kind of really step into like new innovation and change regarding the career, the public recognition, etc. for some of you. But again, um, some of you, you might be feeling that Chiron in like a weird way. So, especially in the eighth house. So, if fear is in the driver's seat, don't let it be. And kind of see what it's trying to tell you, kind of work through if that's the case. And again, also with Saturn involved, really paying attention to your health. So if like health is an issue, wellness, any of those things, like also really not forgetting whatever new chapter you're stepping into, if it is work related, finance, whatever, not forgetting about your health. No amount of career or recognition or whatnot is ever worth bad health. So again, another reminder, I think, for some Virgo risings listening to this, riding this wave, seeing what comes up, what is really pushing you into a new chapter, a new direction, but also considering like, how can I also take care of my health and my wellness as I step into this? If that resonates. Now, once we get to April 19th, this is, I think, another additional opportunity to make some adjustments if needed at this juncture. Because on Sunday, April 19th, this is when Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will be sitting at the 7-degree mark together in that Aries 8th house. Quincunx, the South Node, in your Virgo first house of the self, the physical body, how you move through the world. So at this juncture, I think, Mars is starting to separate from Saturn. So Mars is starting to walk away from that, even intense conversation with Saturn. And this is where, like, when you walk away from a really intense conversation, you start to kind of gain clarity as to, you start digesting like what happened. I think, April 19th, Sunday, going into Monday, the 20th, this could kind of be the time where it's like, all right, we're starting to digest like what has really transpired at this point. We're still in it. Again, Mercury is left in a pretty tight conjunction with Saturn still. So things are logical, things are data driven, things are real, what is authentic, what is tangible with Saturn and Mercury, especially, with Mercury ruling your 10th house of career, public recognition, as well as your first house of the self and the physical body, not being deceived or under any illusionary veil that Neptune may have had you under for a little bit. Now it's real. Like this is, Mercury and Saturn are pretty tight at this point, and this is where I think the real conversation, the real decisions maybe start to transpire around what is really possible in terms of the career direction, what's really possible and logical and grounded around what's going on with you, your physical body, ability to take independent action. That could involve a health situation as well, again, with Saturn ruling that 6th house of health, if that resonates. So, again, the quincunx to the South Node is an adjustment. Now, the quincunx is a minor aspect, it's not a major aspect. So I think if you feel this around this time, it will probably be subtle. But the quincunx to the South Node in the first house of self is sort of like you personally making that adjustment based off of a decision, finances, career, health, work, routines, etc. Making that adjustment so that it really supports you personally. And again, Mercury involved with Saturn and Mars in this quincunx aspect to the South Node in another Mercury ruled area. I think a lot of you could be making decisions or communicating, making changes or adjustments as things have transpired up until this point. But the other Mercury ruled area is this Gemini 10th house of career, business, public recognition, where this adjustment going into next week could be another piece of the puzzle to make adjustments to support Uranus moving into that other Gemini or that other Mercury ruled area, which is your Gemini 10th house of career, business, and public recognition, that Uranus will be in starting next week for roughly the next 7 years, which I will get into in part 4. So definitely stay tuned for part 4 of your April monthly horoscope. That will be posted shortly. Hi, Libra Risings. So Monday, April 13th, this is when Mars has officially separated from Neptune and is pushing up and applying to Saturn for really the majority of this week. And this is happening in your Aries 7th house of personal and or professional partnership. Now, Mars rules your second house of earned income as well. So this could involve sort of a financial matter, a self-worth matter that could be playing out with personal or professional partnerships, excuse me. But the interesting part is that Saturn rules your 4th house of home, family, property, or real estate, or really like just the emotional and physical foundation. So some of you could be heavily focused on like a living situation, your emotional and physical foundation, the finances involved in that could be playing out within a personal or professional partnership, or just sort of influencing the connections you have with others as well. So the other possibility here, just sort of kind of like refreshing what I mentioned last week, Saturn also ruling your 5th house of children, if applicable, creativity, self-expression, and joy. So whether it's, involving your children as well, if that's applicable, I think regardless, a lot of Libra risings, you could be intensely focused on really creating sort of like a new chapter that integrates your joy, what feels good to you. Not only to you, but also how you connect with others or what's playing out within long-term partnership as well. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. But I think this is where things start to become more intense, more part of a longer plan of action with Mars and Saturn really, with Mars really pushing up against Saturn's longevity and commitment in this area of personal and professional partnership. So lots intensifying here, especially in an angular house. Now, as we get to April 14th, so the majority of the day for April 14th is when Mercury is going to be at that 29 degree, anaretic degree, your sense of urgency, sort of like the planets at that last degree really wants to push into Aries. And before it does so, Mercury will sextile Uranus at 29 degrees in your Taurus 8th house. So this could be sort of that closing opportunity. This is happening between your 6th house of daily work, health, and routines, as well as your 8th house of like big decisions, transformational work, or those long-term financial themes that could include a partner's resources, especially with all of this piling up in your 7th house of partnership. So this closing sextile could be an opportunity for some Libra risings, I think, to create sort of like new outcomes to those Mercury ruled areas before Uranus makes its final ingress into that Gemini Mercury ruled area next week, which I'll get to. So this could be even sort of that closing opportunity to create more value and new outcomes to things going on behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns, your overall growth and potential that could be playing out around this time. But I think it's important to pay attention to whatever is happening around, Monday, Tuesday, really getting into this week, if anything at all, because Later on April 14th, certainly when we are getting into Wednesday, April 15th, Mercury's going to shift off that anaretic degree and enter your Aries 7th house of personal and or professional partnerships. So Mercury hits that anaretic degree, sense of urgency, whatever's coming up, where we could be really feeling on April 14th, and then boom, Mercury moves into fire, into that Aries 7th house. So Mercury's going from water to fire, and this could feel like an energetic shift, especially for Libra risings, because Mercury is moving into an angular house. So depending on your natal chart, it's sort of, Mercury can make certain interactions with those angular houses to make changes to sort of career, public recognition, home, family, property, real estate, especially because Mercury's gearing up to push up against the ruler of home, family, property, and real estate, which I'll get to in a moment. But before I get to that, when Mercury enters your Aries 7th house of personal and professional partnership, it's going to immediately apply to Neptune. And I think this is where a lot of Libra risings could start shifting your ideals. Surrendering, dissolving those Mercury-ruled areas that could be even affecting how you connect with others or personal and professional partnerships. So Mercury rules this 9th house of growth and potential, which could include, higher education, travel, spirituality, publishing, teaching, really any growth and potential themes. That could be career related for some of you as well. And Mercury also rules this 12th house of behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns, what's going on mentally, where Mercury could kind of be shifting maybe some of your mental thought patterns, maybe your overall approach to travel, spirituality, higher knowledge, those growth and potential themes, and maybe somehow how they impact how you communicate or connect with others, or how, whatever's playing out within a personal or professional partnership. Whatever it may be, Mercury pushing up against Neptune is definitely the opportunity to kind of see what's dissolving, what's surrendering, but like maybe see like a new potentials, new ideals that maybe you didn't see before around your thought patterns, around those growth and potential themes. Then when we get to April 17th, this is a big day because if you're watching, you'll probably say, holy moly. Like if you're watching, you'll see April 17th, it's Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Chiron, Moon, Sun, this new moon, all piled up in the 7th house of personal and professional partnerships, including marriage, if that's applicable to you. Really your connections with others. So a lot to break down here. So Friday, April 17th, Mercury starts to separate from Neptune, which is what I just discussed. So Mercury's kind of walking away from that conversation and is joining Mars to push up against Saturn. This is where I think things start to move into a really real, authentic, logical, tangible energy. Because now we have Mercury and Mars both separated from Neptune, which is like the ideal, the illusion, maybe even deception. So you've been kind of, I think, working maybe behind the scenes or working with growth and potential, working with sort of these new ideals take shape, and Mercury then separates and applies to Saturn for a little while, for really at least a few days. You'll probably feel this, where Mercury Saturn is very logical. It's things get really real. I think with Mercury and Mars, especially with Mars ruling your second house of earned income, self-worth, ruling this area of personal and professional partnerships, with Mercury pushing up against Saturn, it's sort of like the commitment, the longevity, the legacy, that could involve sort of your connections with others, partnership, finances, growth and potential, maybe what's playing out behind the scenes for some of you, and how Saturn's that boundary there to say, what are you committing to? Where are you going with this? Especially as these new cycles could play out for the next couple years with these personal planets applying to Saturn. Additionally, with Mercury and Mars applying to this Saturn here, I think this is when, like, when it comes to like property, real estate, relationships with family, home, those kinds of themes for some Libra risings, this is where like the plan of action, the desire, the growth and potential could become more real, more tangible at this point. Additionally, on Friday, April 17th, there's going to be this new moon at 27 degrees in this area of connections with others, personal and professional partnerships, marriage, if applicable. So this is another layer where a lot of you could be ready to step into that new chapter, plant those seeds, initiate whatever is playing out with Mercury and Mars sort of initiating new cycles with Neptune and Saturn around this time. So I think a lot of you could be kind of stepping into a new chapter or ready to plant those seeds to kind of step into whatever's playing out with these personal planets here with Saturn and Neptune. However, this new moon is conjunct Chiron. And so there maybe it's like bittersweet, or Chiron's the wounded healer. So maybe stepping into this new chapter, there's something like you have to work with or you have to face that feels a little crunchy for some of you, feels a little uncomfortable. Some of you love Chiron, and so some of you might be really ready to step into initiating these new chapters and stepping into whatever longevity and commitment you're creating around finances, partnership, growth and potential, what's going on behind the scenes, mental thought patterns. There's so many potentials here playing out for Libra risings, especially with it being in an angular house and even creating change and action towards your career, your public recognition, home, family, property, real estate. So this packs so much potential for Libra risings in terms of what is initiating in these new chapters, depending on your natal chart. But Chiron being involved, I think some of you are going to love this. And some of you might feel a little uncomfortable with this. Like, maybe there's been, there's, especially, I think with the Chiron aspect, jumping to April 19th, for Libra rising. So Sunday, April 19th, I think part of the Chiron situation that might resonate for some of you could involve the quincunx, the uncomfortable adjustment between Mercury, Saturn, and Mars at 7 degrees, quincunx, the south node, in your 12th house of subconscious thought patterns, what's going on behind the scenes. So there could be all this stuff initiating, all this stuff happening. But I think the Chiron aspect for some Libra risings, you might have to make an adjustment to maybe your mental thought patterns. Like some of you might be seeing how your subconscious thought patterns like limit you or self-sabotage you, and how it could be for some of you playing out with how you connect with others, or how it plays out within current long-term partnerships. So again, take what resonates, but regardless, on Sunday, April 19th, Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will be at the 7 degree mark in your 7th house of partnership, quincunx the south node. So it's sort of like what needs to be released, what needs to be sort of dealt with behind the scenes, mentally, subconscious thought patterns where you maybe limit yourself, self-sabotage yourselves, making adjustments to those areas, releasing if necessary, to be able to step into these new cycles playing out. But I think Mercury left applying quite closely to a conjunction with Saturn at the time of this quincunx taking place, this adjustment. This, I think, helps with staying logical for a lot of us, even collectively. What's the data? What's the logic? So to kind of like help make that adjustment for some of you, again, if it resonates. But regardless, I think Mercury being involved in this quincunx to the south node in this Mercury ruled 12th house of subconscious thought patterns behind the scenes is also potentially helping you make adjustments to, your mental thought patterns, what's going on behind the scenes, how you connect with others, what's playing out within personal and professional partnerships, as well as its impacts to home, family, property, real estate themes. Sort of that, the quincunx between Mercury to a Mercury ruled area could also be helping make that adjustment and be providing what's needed for some Libra risings to support Uranus moving into the other Mercury ruled area next week, which will be in your Gemini 9th house of growth and potential for roughly the next 7 years. So this is not, I don't think this is just involving, like how you connect with others, what's playing out with long-term partnerships, maybe making adjustments to like how you limit yourself, how you self-sabotage yourself, how that shows up in your connections with others, and how it might even be sort of impacting or playing out with home, family, property, real estate. As you're trying to initiate all these new cycles, new chapters, new things kind of happening, but how it can also potentially help support, roughly for the next 7 years as Uranus moves into that Gemini 9th house of growth and potential, where a lot of you could be, really changing and innovating your knowledge, your spirituality, your travel, your truth, your belief, your higher knowledge. So many things that could also be career related for some of you. So this could also be playing into a much bigger picture that you could be moving into starting next week, which I will break down in the April monthly horoscope part 4. So stay tuned for that. Hey, Scorpio risings. So Monday, April 13th, we have Mars officially separating from Neptune and applying or pushing up to Saturn in your Aries 6th house of daily work, health, and routines. Now, Saturn rules your 4th house of home, family, property, and real estate. So with Mars pushing up against Saturn for really the majority of this week, a lot of you could be moving into a new plan of action, new desire, new motivation regarding the emotional and physical foundations in your lives, your living situation, property, real estate, and its impacts to your work, your health, and your routines. Now, Saturn also rules your Capricorn 3rd house of communication, exchanging information, siblings, extended family. So Mars could be also implementing sort of a new chapter, a new cycle with your communication, exchanging information, siblings, extended family, your neighborhood, your community, and its impacts to your work, your health, and your routines as well. Now, once we get to April 14th, really the majority of the day on April 14th, for many of us, Mercury will be sitting at that 29 degree mark, that anaretic degree, a sense of urgency, intensity, sextile Uranus at 29 degrees in that Taurus 7th house of personal and or professional partnerships. So Mercury rules your 11th house of long-term goals, social network, as well as your Gemini 8th house of those long-term financial themes, investments, assets, debt, loans, partners, resources, which I think is really interesting because the sextile involves Uranus in the 7th house of partnership. So this could be sort of that closing opportunity that could feel quite intense. Regarding financial themes, sort of long-term goals, even social network that could be playing out between your 5th house of children, if applicable, creativity, self-expression, joy, and your 7th house of how you connect with others, your personal and professional partnerships. Regardless of what is playing out around Monday, Tuesday. So again, April 13th, April 14th, as Mercury is pushing into this 29th degree in your Pisces 5th house, pay attention to what is coming up around this time, because later on April 14th, certainly April 15th, for a lot of us, Mercury is then going to shift into your Aries 6th house of daily work and or health routines. So again, that transition of Mercury at that last degree of intensity, making a sextile to Uranus, and then right after going from 29 degrees in a water sign to 0 degrees of a fire sign. That shift in energy, that shift in, what came up, Monday, Tuesday, and how it could be shifting and changing our focus and our energy into something entirely, kind of like moving it on to something entirely different that feels a bit more fiery, a bit more initiating. But again, I want to point out, as soon as Mercury enters your Aries 6th house, it's going to immediately apply to Neptune for the next couple days. So it's kind of an interesting time where I think a lot of Scorpio risings, you could be kind of shifting your communication could be kind of shifting the ideals, the potentials, maybe communicating through what feels illusionary versus what feels real, especially with Mercury going to then apply to Saturn in a few days. Either way, this could be kind of having a lot of Scorpio risings look at those Mercury ruled areas, which is going to be your long-term goals, your social network, your long-term financial themes or management, partners, resources if applicable, and how it's coming to fruition around maybe shifting your ideals. Like maybe some of you want to shift something with your work, your health, your routines, and you're kind of changing the way you communicate or work with your finances, your long-term goals, etc. So again, paying attention to what those Mercury ruled areas, how they're shifting, how they're changing, what is dissolving, surrendering to kind of make way for something new for some of you regarding sort of the work that you want to do, the health and vitality you want to feel, the routines that support that. So then we get to April 17th, which is kind of a wow day. So if you're watching, you're going to see pretty much everything in your Aries 6th house of daily work and or health routines. So let's break this down. Friday, April 17th, excuse me. I'm recording this early when Mercury is retrograde in Pisces, and I am struggling, so bear with me. So Mercury on April 17th is starting to separate from Neptune and starting to apply to Saturn with Mars. And I think this is where things become a lot more real. Not only because Mars is getting a lot closer to Saturn, really intensifying Mars-ruled areas, which is going to be your work, your health, and also your first house of the physical body and the self. So some of you could also be really kind of seeing the intensity or maybe new plan of action regarding sort of like that emotional and physical foundation that's going to support your health, your physical body, or the work that you really want to do. But now Mercury starts to join in on the mix and basically integrate, well, what's the long-term goal? Who do we really want to surround ourselves with? What's the dream, the aspiration, the financial future, and the decisions necessary in order to make this a concrete, real potential? Because when Mercury starts to apply to Saturn, this becomes very logical, right? Mercury and Saturn are moving away from Neptune, the deception, the illusion, the fantasy, and it's Mercury and Mars applying to Saturn, which is reality. What's authentic, what's real. I think a lot of you could be stepping into a cycle of, I don't want to think about it anymore. I don't want to make it a real thing. And this could involve, a living situation, relationships with family, your work, your health, your physical body. So there's a lot of potential here, but I think for a lot of Scorpio risings, this becomes more, especially with Mars ruling your first house of self, this personal feeling of, I want this plan of action to actually become a tangible reality. I don't want it to be an idea anymore. And trying to sort out sort of the resources, the finances, the decisions, the long-term goals necessary in order to make that a real thing. And at the same time, on Friday, April 17th, there'll be a new moon at 27 degrees in this Aries 6th house of daily work and health routines. So this is an additional layer of a new chapter, initiating a new beginning. And I think this new moon comes along and says, all right, what have you sort of untangled with Neptune that now you're focused on Saturn and the legacy, the commitment, the longevity, the authenticity, the real tangible thing you want to make and build over the next couple years, especially with Mars, and really initiating this new chapter that can sort of play out over the next 5 or 6 months. So some of you might be kind of saying, all right, let's kind of break this. Instead of looking at it from like a couple year cycle, that this new moon, I think, comes along at the right time for some of us and says, let's just focus on what we want to build in a real logical way over the next 5 or 6 months. Let's take it in segments. But this new moon is technically conjunct Chiron. So maybe there is, some, Chiron's the wounded healer. Excuse me. And so some of you might be kind of stepping into and initiating this new chapter where, like, especially moving away from Neptune, like some of you might be seeing like the real reality, what's actually necessary to build this new reality, this new chapter in a real tangible way. Whether it's, the resources, the finances, the social network, or just, your living situation, home, family, property, real estate, whatever it may be, and kind of like, feeling that, like, when we come back down to earth and we're like, okay, this is the budget, this is the data, this is sort of just like the reality. Or it sort of reminds me of like many things in my life, especially with having this business, the moments in my life where it was a dream, it was an idea, and being able to kind of get lost in that versus actually having to build it. It's been incredible. But you know, it has that Chiron effect of like it's beautiful. It's like the wounded healer, but you're, you know, coming to terms with certain aspects of yourself or certain aspects of your life that maybe really need to change in a real tangible way in order for you to move into what you really want to move into. So that's, I think, a potential here with that. But some of you love Chiron. Some of you love Chiron. And so some of you might be stepping into this new moon and these new cycles. Especially with Mars in rulership, Mars ruling your first house, there might be this sense of like I've been waiting for this and I'm ready for this and I feel more than ever to tackle this in a real way. So some of you might love this energy. Either way, we get to April 19th, where I think Sunday, April 19th provides the opportunity to maybe make some adjustments if necessary, because Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will be sitting at the 7-degree mark on Sunday, April 19th, quincunx the South Node in your Virgo 11th house of social network, whether it's personal or professional, and your long-term goals. So I think, you know, the quincunx is not a major aspect, it's a minor aspect, and it often involves an adjustment. And so some of you could be making an adjustment to sort of like your routines, your work, your health to support a long-term goal or vice versa. But I think what's interesting about this quincunx, zooming out for a second here, is that with Mercury being involved, Mercury is in a quincunx to the South Node in a Mercury ruled area. The other Mercury ruled area is your Gemini 8th house of partners, resources, long-term financial management, big decisions, transformation, where Uranus is about to make its final ingress into that Gemini 8th house for roughly the next 7 years, starting next week, which I'll get to in part 4. But this could be the adjustment necessary between sort of like the work, the health, the routines, the long-term goals, and maybe helping you make those adjustments to help support Uranus moving into this 8th house to sort of create some change and some innovation to the long-term financial goals, management, partners, resources, you know, necessary big decisions you're not going to go back on. Stuff like that. So I think that could be playing into the larger picture here, among many other things. But again, on Sunday, April 19th, this is when Mars is going to start to separate from Saturn. So some of you, if you felt that intensity between Mars and Saturn, especially with Mars being in rulership in a fire sign, Mars separating from Saturn, you know, Mars is like walking away from the conversation, basically. And so Sunday going into Monday, you can start to feel the dissipating, you know, Mars walking away from Saturn. We've got the plan of action that ultimately can play out over the next 2.5 years around home, family, property, real estate, work, health, routines, and you personally with what Mars rules in your chart. And Mars is separating, but Mercury's left behind in a close conjunction with Saturn. So I think, you know, I'm hoping the quincunx, you know, being able to make that adjustment if necessary with Mars kind of dissipating, walking away from that intensity with Saturn, where Mercury is left conjunct Saturn, I think to help support the adjustment necessary to the long-term goals, the dreams, the aspiration, the right people to surround yourselves with, or sort of the resources, the financial future, and the decisions, you know, necessary in order to really logically initiate sort of this new cycle here that could also involve you looking at home, family, property, real estate, you know, that emotional and physical foundation that's going to support surrounding you with the right people, that's going to support the long-term goals, also support, you know, your financial future, your ability to make, you know, big decisions with Uranus moving into that area shortly for the next, roughly 7 years, really helping you innovate that area as well. So definitely stay tuned for part 4 of your April monthly horoscope, where I'll break down more of the Uranus ingress into your Gemini 8th house. Hi, Sagittarius Risings. So Monday, April 13th, this is when Mars has officially separated from Neptune and is pushing up and applying to Saturn, really for the majority of this week. So again, reiterating the intensity that could be building here, especially because Mars is in its home sign. And so Mars could be pushing up a plan of action, new desires, new motivation around Saturn ruled areas, which is going to be your second house of earned income, value system, self-worth, as well as the other Saturn ruled area, which includes siblings, extended family, communication, exchanging information. So some of you could be kind of like initiating a new plan of action with siblings, extended family. Even for some of you, it could be home, family, property, real estate. Themes could be involved in here depending on your natal chart, with additional financial themes mixed in if that resonates around this time. Either way, Mars is pushing up against Saturn for the majority of this week, so definitely paying attention to those themes as Saturn rules those areas. And Mars could be pushing up a new plan of action in this Aries 5th house of children, if applicable, creativity, self-expression. So those additional themes could be, or some of you could be exploring, the finances, the siblings, extended family, communication. Again, some of you could be home, family, property, real estate themes. And doing so because of children, family planning, creative projects, self-expression, etc. So those are additional things that could be coming up for some Sagittarius risings. Now, getting to April 14th. Oops, I'm on day, not hour. So April 14th is when Mercury, for the majority of the day on the 14th, for most of us, will be at that 29th anaretic sense of urgency degree in your Pisces 4th house of home, family, property, and real estate, making that closing sextile to Uranus at that 29th degree in your Taurus 6th house of daily work, health, and routines. So some of you could be, intensely focused on creating an opportunity or creating more value to something regarding, playing out with home, family, property, real estate, as well as sort of like your health, work routines. But I think, Mercury rules your Gemini 7th house of personal and professional partnerships, including marriage, if applicable to you. So some of you could be really like taking an opportunity regarding like home and family, work, health, and routines to create new outcomes that maybe add more value to something playing out within a long-term partnership. But Mercury also rules your Virgo 10th house of career, business, and public recognition. So some of you could be focused more on the professional aspect, where maybe you're trying to take an opportunity to create, more balance to your routines, your work, your living situation, to create, new outcomes or more value to the career, the business, the public recognition. So I think some of you could be focused more on sort of like the internal personal aspects of like your relationship, the home and family, how things are playing out with like routines, work. And then some of you might also be looking at your professional partnerships, the work, what's going on with your foundation and, seeing opportunities or creating new opportunities for more value and new outcomes to the career, business, public recognition. So again, take what resonates, leave the rest. Either way, Monday, Tuesday, pay attention to what could be intensifying if that resonates, because once we get to late on Tuesday, certainly as we get into Wednesday, this is when Mercury is going to enter your Aries fifth house of joy, creativity, self-expression, children if applicable to you. But I want to point out, Mercury goes from being at that 29th degree in a water sign to hours later moving into a fire sign. So a lot of you could feel that shift in energy or direction to what comes up Monday, Tuesday, and then Mercury shifts your energy into that Aries fire sign where Mercury will immediately apply to Neptune in this Aries fifth house of joy, creativity, self-expression, children, if applicable to you. Now, this is where, if you know your natal chart and your IC is at the beginning degrees of this Aries fifth house, this could heavily, heavily involve home, family, property, and real estate regarding marriage, personal and professional partnerships, its impacts to those areas, as well as sort of career, business, public recognition, because that's what Mercury rules. And it could be really going over interacting with your IC, ruling home, family, property, real estate. Anyways, generally speaking, however, with Mercury ruling your seventh house of partnership, whether it's personal or professional, and your 10th house of career, public recognition, shifting into Aries, applying to Neptune, a lot of you could be kind of like shifting your ideals around the career or shifting something around what's playing out within a personal partnership, business partnership. Some of you could be kind of playing around or communicating different ideas, different ideals that could be playing out with career or something playing out with personal and professional partnership. That, again, for some of you could be home and family related with partnership. Either way, a lot of you could also be kind of dissolving, surrendering something with your career, your business, your public recognition. Some of you could also be sort of dissolving or surrendering the other Mercury ruled area, your seventh house of personal and professional partnerships. Now, don't freak out. This doesn't mean your partnership is going to completely dissolve. Absolutely not. I actually think that this could be, from a bigger perspective, this Mercury Neptune, if you're partnered up, this Mercury Neptune could be shifting and surrendering something that no longer supports the new chapter that the partnership is going into, which could involve children, family planning, if that's applicable to you. So again, that is a possibility here with this because Mercury rules this Gemini area that Uranus is about to make its final ingress into this area of partnership. So this Mercury conjunct Neptune could be saying, hey, what do we not want to take with us in this new chapter? And this is happening in the fifth house. So it's sort of like, what doesn't support our children? What doesn't support our joy, our self-expression in this new chapter that we could be moving into? Now, if you're not partnered up, you don't have children, this could really involve, I think, sort of like the career, the business, the public recognition, your creativity, your self-expression. So some of you could be kind of like, shifting your ideal, how you want to communicate, express yourself creatively. That could kind of be setting things up for the action and change that Uranus could be making roughly over the next 7 years with the square to that other Mercury ruled area, which is your 10th house of career, business, and public recognition. But I don't want to get too in the weeds with this. So let's jump to April 17th, which is a jam-packed day. Because if you're watching, if you're listening and not watching, Friday, April 17th will be Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Chiron, Moon, Sun in this new moon phase all in this Aries fifth house of joy, creativity, self-expression, children if applicable to you. And then again, reiterating, if your IC is in this fifth house, this Aries fifth house, this could have strong home, family, property, real estate themes for those individuals. So let's break this down a little bit. Let's break down this pile up here. Friday, April 17th, Mercury will officially be separating from Neptune, which I just discussed, and now is applying to Saturn with Mars. This changes things. This, like, Friday, April 17th, going into the weekend, I think this is where things now become very real, because Mercury and Mars have passed through Neptune and is now applying to Saturn, which is boundaries, longevity, commitment, legacy, what's real, what's tangible, what is logical, especially with a Mercury-Saturn situation. So I think with Mercury joining the application with Mars to Saturn, this is where things, maybe at this point you've kind of mulled over the ideas and the potentials, what needs to dissolve, what needs to surrender, moving into this new chapter. And now it's like, okay, well, we got to implement it. We got to do the thing. And this could be the very beginning stages of this logical step-by-step, a real approach to make that plan real, moving away from Neptune, getting away from things being just an idea and staying an idea. And now making it, stepping into a chapter of, let's stop thinking about it as an idea and actually make it real. And for you, it's involving the ruler of your career, partnership, the ruler of, children if applicable, your creativity, your self-expression, your thought patterns, as well as the ruler of your money, your self-worth, your communication, all congealing together and coming together in this fifth house, where additionally we have this new moon at 27 degrees in this fifth house. That's to me an additional layer of a new beginning, a new chapter. It's in a cardinal sign. Cardinal signs are initiating signs. They're the start of a season. So this is an additional layer of, like, I think, or an indicator that a lot of you could be stepping into a new chapter. A new chapter with what is transpiring around maybe the partnership, the children if applicable, the career, the finances, the communication, your daily environment. So a lot's happening here where I think a lot of you could be stepping into this new chapter, but this new moon is conjunct Chiron. And so I think, I've thought about this for a little bit, and I think the Chirons, some of us love Chiron, and will be stepping into this new chapter ready, like aware of Chiron's the wounded healer. So some of you could love Chiron and be stepping into this new chapter and be like, love self-development and like love the new and where things show you parts of yourselves. But some of you, this could feel, a little uncomfortable. And after some thought, I could be totally wrong on this, but I think with Saturn, Mars, and then Mercury merging with Neptune, right? The ideal, the illusion, the deceit, the fantasy, the creativity. Neptune is illusionary. And then moving away from Neptune and applying to Saturn, which is like, yo, what's real? Like, what are you really going to build? what are you really going to do? Like, what's the logical step towards what you want to build over the next couple years here? Then the new moon comes along conjunct Chiron, and I think it's like, all right, well, we're stepping into this new chapter. And I think that Chiron is sort of like, Chiron's it's also the bridge as well. I think a lot of us could be feeling that Chiron wounded healer between like going from something that is like an exciting idea and then going, okay, now it's happening. This is a real reality, which can feel exciting. But it's sort of like the example I gave to another rising sign that came through to me is like, when I started this business, like for many, many years, it was just a fantasy. It was just an idea and it was exciting. And then the moment you go to do it, it's still exciting, but a hard reality comes into play. It's like, this is all on you. You have, like, Saturn's like, what are you going to commit to? You have to take care of the things. Like, even if you don't want to do it, there's going to be some things that you still got to do. And I think, zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, I think Chiron conjunct the new moon here is sort of like, where have we gone from something being an idea, a fantasy, an illusion in our head, to now actually making it into or building a real reality around it? And it can be exciting and it can be really initiating. But there's a reality that sets in with that of like, this is really happening. Sort of, to stick with the fifth house themes, where fifth house can involve children, sort of like, you try to get pregnant, and then you get pregnant, and then it's so exciting, and you have a baby shower, and then you give birth, and it's so beautiful, and it's so incredible in so many ways, and it's amazing, this new chapter. But a new reality sets in where you're like, oh my God, this is my life now. So, sticking to that fifth house theme, I think that Chiron there with the new moon is like, we're stepping into a new chapter. Might feel a little wonky, a little wounded, but also really amazing at the same time. So, those are kind of the analogies I'm giving, kind of seeing with this that might resonate with some Sagittarius risings around this time. So again, not letting, like, allowing it to flow, right? Again, reiterating, all of this is happening in your fifth house, which means it is trine your first house of self, physical body, how you move through the world. So if April at this point is starting to feel like, whoa, like, a little crunchy, or you're feeling that Chiron effect with all this new stuff coming into gear, remind yourselves, it's trying your first house. How is this dissolving the obstacles and allowing you to flow more, to take more independent action, to focus more on your needs, your identity, how you want to move through the world? And sometimes that adjustment can be a little uncomfortable, but kind of keeping your focus on how this is actually supporting you, or pushing you into a new chapter where it's supporting you and how you want to move through the world. It's also trine your Leo ninth house of growth and potential. So like, if you're feeling that, focusing on, all right, maybe I'm feeling all these things, but like, how is this actually supporting the bigger picture in my life at this time? So again, so much happening here. And then we get to April 19th. And I think April 19th is a day where a potentially minor, subtle opportunity could come into play for some Aquarius, for some Sagittarius risings. Because on Sunday, April 19th, My God, sorry. I'm recording this when Mercury is retrograde and I have an exalted Mercury, so bear with me here. Okay. I'm going to redo that. So by the time we get to Sunday, April 19th, this is when Mercury, Saturn, and Mars will be sitting at that 7-degree mark in your Aries fifth house, quincunx the South Node in your Virgo 10th house of career, business, and public recognition. So this is when Mars starts to officially separate from Saturn, which could be kind of like Mars walking away from that really intense conversation. Anytime we walk away from an intense conversation, even if it was like a good intense, we kind of like think about it. We start to kind of like, we get breathing room. So like Mars is starting to get a little breathing room from Saturn's boundaries and structures and commitment. And, this is where like some of that intensity can start to dissipate a little bit moving forward. And the very subtle quincunx, right, which is an adjustment going on, where some of you could be making an adjustment between what brings you joy versus what is fulfilling, what's going on with children if applicable, and making adjustments to your career plans, your business, your public recognition. Fifth house, making adjustments between your creativity, your self-expression, your artistry, to this 10th house of career, business, public recognition. So again, whatever it may be, there is this adjustment to sort of like your public image, your career, your business, what feels fulfilling to you versus, like making that adjustment to what is joyful for you, what is your heart's desire around this time, was so much initiating in this fifth house area of joy. And maybe for some of you, what's initiating in this fifth house area is having you then make a sort of like a subtle adjustment to the career, the business, the public recognition around this time. Now, additionally, I want to point out that Mercury will be in this quincunx, as I mentioned, but Mercury will be in this quincunx to the South Node in this Mercury ruled area. Mercury rules your Virgo 10th house. So the other Mercury ruled area is your 7th house of personal and professional partnerships. So some of you could be gearing up or making slight adjustments, necessary adjustments to maybe career, what feels fulfilling versus what's going on in this 5th house. That could include personal and professional partnerships. That could be helping, like those adjustments that you're making around this time could be helping Uranus making that final ingress into that other Mercury ruled area of partnership, which I will break down in your April monthly horoscope part 4. So stay tuned for that. Hi, Capricorn Risings. So Monday, April 13th is when Mars starts to separate officially from Neptune and apply and push up to Saturn in your Aries 4th house of home, family, property, and real estate. So Mars really for the majority of this week could be pushing up, creating new plan of action, desire, and motivation around Saturn ruled areas, which is your 1st house of self, physical body, as well as your Aquarius 2nd house of earned income and self-worth. So a lot of you could be creating sort of like a new plan of action, a new desire around the emotional and physical foundation that's going to support you, support your independent action, but also support any plan of action around your finances, your self-worth, etc. Now, getting to April 14th, for the majority of the day on April 14th, Tuesday, Mercury is going to be sitting around that 29th anaretic degree, that sense of urgency degree, sextile Uranus at 29 degrees in your Taurus 5th house. So Mercury could be sort of creating that closing sextile, potentially, some opportunity or the desire to create more value to outcomes, to Mercury ruled areas. So some of you could be really looking at like your immediate environment, what really brings you joy, and looking to create sort of new opportunities or more value to the Mercury ruled areas, such as your Gemini sixth house of health, work, and routines, and also your Virgo ninth house of growth and potential, which could include higher knowledge, travel, spirituality, publishing, teaching. Some of this could be career related for some of you. So, again, this could be sort of like for some of you, if it resonates going into Monday and Tuesday, this could be that closing sextile to try to create some opportunity or value to new outcomes to those Mercury ruled areas. Either way, pay attention to what could be intensifying around Monday, Tuesday, because when Mercury shifts into Aries, literally hours later, very late on April 14th, certainly by Wednesday, April 15th for a lot of us, Mercury will be shifting from that anaretic degree in that water sign into the 0 degree mark of a fire sign. So a lot of you could feel that shift in energy that Mercury could be making. And Mercury has now entered your Aries fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate, applying to Neptune. So whatever could have intensified, going into Monday, Tuesday, this could be playing into how you're then taking that situation and sort of shifting your ideals, surrendering, dissolving something regarding those Mercury ruled areas. So again, Mercury rules your Gemini sixth house of daily work, health, and routines. So Mercury applying to Neptune could be helping you sort of communicate your ideals, maybe dissolve and surrender things that no longer support your work, your health, and your routines that could heavily involve a living situation, your emotional and physical foundation. Now, Mercury, again, also rules your Virgo ninth house. So think higher education, travel, spirituality, publishing, teaching, really any growth and potential theme that resonates with you that could be career related, that you could be discussing, communicating around your new ideals, helping dissolve, surrender anything that really doesn't support your overall growth and potential as you're maybe gearing up to make some changes around your emotional and physical foundation and how it may support those things. Then we get to April 17th. And April 17th, my God, so much is happening in your Aries fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate, because Mercury starts to separate from that Neptune and apply to Saturn with Mars. And I think Friday, April 17th, moving onward, moving forward, really through even the 19th, 20th, this is where things get very real. I want to pull back and remind you, Saturn, Mars, Mercury have all now passed through Neptune's illusions, fantasies, ideals, and is now applying to Saturn, which is the boundaries, the reality, what's tangible, what's authentic, what are you committing to? And so this is where things get more real, things get more logical, with Mercury and Mars applying to Saturn. So this is where I think Mercury could start to, as Mercury's pushing up against Saturn, this is where Mercury could start merging those Mercury ruled areas with those Saturn ruled areas. And again, I think a lot of this is going to be like, what emotional and physical foundation supports all of these themes coming into play this month? And with Mercury applying to Saturn now, with Mars in the mix, it's sort of like, Mercury ruling your health, your work, your routines, and your ninth house of growth and potential. What's getting very real? Like what was an ideal or an idea that now is the time to make a reality. Where is it? No, like it's no longer an idea. We're moving forward. We're making this a real reality. And I think a lot of Capricorn risings, you're going to be looking at sort of your health, your work, your overall growth and potential with financial themes and sort of that emotional and physical foundation that is ultimately going to support you, support your finances, your health, your work, and your overall growth and potential moving forward with what these planets rule. Additionally, on Friday, April 17th, there's going to be this new moon at 27 degrees. So, this new moon comes along at a very interesting time where all these new cycles are starting. And this new moon is an additional indicator of initiating a new chapter. And I think these planetary cycles for even, especially with Mars, could be playing out over the next 2.5 years. But this new moon, I think, is sort of the ability to say, all right, we're gonna focus on the next 5 or 6 months, initiating a new chapter, a new goal, this new cycle, but kind of taking it like, all right, what can I tangibly, logically work with regarding finances, my foundation, my health, my work over the next 5 or 6 months. This new moon is also conjunct Chiron. So maybe some of you are moving into a new chapter foundationally. Now, Chiron's the wounded healer. So some of you could be moving into this new chapter, initiating, planting new seeds that could feel weird, could feel a little wounded, where maybe some of you are coming to terms with that transition of the idea versus the reality. And it kind of came through to me, and I could be totally wrong, but it came through to me and it just really sunk in for me where, Mercury, Mars, and Saturn in this picture having moved through Neptune, right? The ideal, the ideas, the creativity, the fantasy, even the illusion or the deception, right? Where we thinking about an idea or the thing versus actually doing it with the Saturn is a hard reality. And I think that's where the Chiron comes into place with this new moon of like, you're stepping into a new chapter and initiating new things that become very real at this point. But I think some of you could love this Chiron. Some of us love Chiron. And so some of you could be really ready to step into this new moon with Chiron and be like, I've been waiting for this. I've worked with this. Like, I know exactly how to kind of navigate this. And then some of you might be more Neptunian. Some of you might love like being in the metaphysical and, the fantasy and the creativity and the ideals and the ideas of things. And then, especially with this happening in the 4th house, which is such a foundational area of your chart, really kind of tangibly, logically coming back down to earth. And this new moon Chiron saying, all right, you got the idea, you've got the ideals, now go. Build it, do it. And sort of thinking about doing something versus actually doing something, there's just a new reality taking place here. And so I think that's a potential with the Chiron new moon. Either way, I think, some of you are going to love it. Some of you are going to be like, whoa, this is, like, sometimes I just want to go back into like the meditation and thinking about it and, all the feel goods and feel good potentials. But I think this is asking a lot of Capricorn risings to say like, this is the time to build it. This is the time to really initiate it in a way that it can become that tangible reality instead of it just being an idea or a thing that's going to happen in the future. Then we get to April 19th, and this is the day where I think there's a subtle opportunity worth mentioning between Mercury, Mars, and Saturn all being at the 7-degree mark, quincunx the south node in your Virgo 9th house of growth and potential. So the quincunx is the adjustment. So I think at this point on Sunday, April 19th, going into Monday, April 20th, this could be the time that some of you could be, have had sat with, what's transpired, what's really come up at this point. And I want to point out that on Sunday, April 19th, this is later in the day, Mars is going to start to separate from Saturn. So Mars is going to start walking away from the conversation with Saturn, sort of walking away, dissipating, I think, some of that intensity with a Mars-Saturn conjunction, especially with Mars in its place of rulership, which can add the intensity to it. Like sometimes there's like mitigating factors that kind of dampen or like lessen the intensity of these planets. But with Mars being in rulership, it's sort of like, well, this is Mars' house, Mars rules. So with Mercury, Mars, and Saturn all being at 7 degrees, quincunx, this adjustment between your emotional and physical foundation versus the growth and potential area of your chart, or vice versa. So some of you could be making adjustments to those areas to potentially support not only this Mercury ruled area, right? Because Mercury is involved directly with the quincunx to the south node in this Mercury ruled area, your Virgo 9th house of growth and potential. But I also want to kind of zoom you out a little bit and remind you that the other Mercury ruled area is your Gemini 6th house of daily work, health, and routine. So there could be some adjustments to, routines to support your health, to support the work that you really want to do. But that could all this adjustment going on at this time to, with Mercury to a Mercury ruled area as Uranus is about to make its final ingress into the other Mercury ruled area of work, health, and routines. This could be the point that could be helping Capricorn risings to make that necessary adjustment, even if it's a little uncomfortable, quincunx, it's subtle, but it's that adjustment that could be necessary to, not only between sort of the foundation and the overall growth and potential, but it could also be helping you make the adjustment to support Uranus's ingress to innovate and change the work, the health, and the routines as Uranus makes its final ingress next week. So definitely stay tuned for your April monthly horoscope part 4, where I will break down that ingress for you. Hi, Aquarius risings. So Monday, April 13th, this is when Mars officially starts to separate from Neptune and immediately apply and push up against Saturn for the majority of this week in your Aries 3rd house of communication, exchanging information, technology, short distance travel, siblings, extended family. So lots going on here. However, what I think this could specifically bring up for a lot of Aquarius risings, or intensify this week with a lot of Aquarius risings, is the new plan of action, desires, and motivations that are affecting Saturn ruled areas. So I think this could really sort of integrate the Mars ruled area, which is your Scorpio 10th house of career, business, public recognition, and Saturn, which is ruling your 1st house of self, physical body, how you take independent action. So I think some of you could be kind of moving into a new chapter of, changing your plan of action, your motivation, your desires around the career, the business, the public recognition, and its impacts to you. So some of you could be changing your plan of action because maybe like what you've done, what you've, been working on or experimenting with, whatever it is. Maybe some of you are at a point where you're like, kind of want to change what I exert my energy towards with career, business, and public recognition. So that's a possibility there. But, Saturn also rules your Capricorn 12th house of behind the scenes, subconscious thought patterns, where you limit yourself, where you self-sabotage yourself. So some of you could be really also moving into a new chapter of desire, motivation, to really building, maybe, what really supports you personally, the career, the business, the public recognition, but in a way that also mentally supports you, supports your rest, your recharge, behind the scenes stuff in your lives. So I think it's interesting. I think this could be a season where a lot of Aquarius risings are sort of equilibrating and reevaluating the action, the energy, even sort of like the mental energy invested in the work, the career, the public recognition, or what feels fulfilling to you. Now, as we get to April 14th, the next day, this is when Mercury, before that, actually. So April 14th, interesting day, because Mercury will first be at that 29th degree in your Pisces second house of earned income and self-worth, at that closing sextile to Uranus at 29 degrees in your Taurus fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate. So sure, this is between a financial house and a foundational sort of, home, family, property, real estate house. But Mercury rules your Gemini fifth house of joy and your Virgo eighth house of, transformation, big decisions, long-term financial themes or management. And so again, this could be that closing opportunity to create more value, not only to your finances and your foundation, but also sort of your value system, your self-worth. And with Mercury ruling your fifth house, also sort of the opportunity to create more value to your joy, your creativity, your self-expression, or children if applicable to you. So this could be a very, this is happening at the Aneretic degree. So some of you could feel this intensely, or there could be a sense of urgency around those themes. But I would pay attention to what comes up Monday, Tuesday, because late on Tuesday, certainly as we get into really early on Wednesday for a lot of us, that's when Mercury is going to move off of that Aneretic degree, that 29th degree, to that sextile with Uranus, as I just discussed, and then move into 0 degrees of Aries. So Mercury's moving from the last degree in water to the first degree or 0 degrees of fire. So this is a shift in sort of what initially maybe comes up for some of you Monday, Tuesday, and how it shifts into a different tone or a different vibe come Wednesday. And when Mercury enters Aries, it's going to immediately apply to Neptune for the next couple days. So this is where Mercury ruled areas could start to shift, dissolve, surrender. Maybe and this Mercury is the planet of communication, and this is literally happening in your third house of communication, exchanging information. So this could be, some of you could be conversing, exchanging information, communicating, new ideas, new ideals around your creativity, what brings you joy, as well as sort of the resources or decisions maybe necessary to consider in whatever is shifting with this Mercury-Neptune situation. But definitely pay attention to what, ideas, conversations, information gets exchanged regarding sort of what's going on with creativity, self-expression, financial themes, resources necessary, maybe gearing up to make some big decisions as well, that you could be sort of reaching out or trying to exchange information um, to help you make that decision, or sort of, communicate or sort out what is going on around this time. Because once you get to Friday, April 17th, this is when a whole lot's going on. So Friday, April 17th, that's when Mercury starts to walk away from the conversation with Neptune. Mercury starts to separate from Neptune and immediately start to push up and apply to Saturn with Mars. So Mercury applying to Neptune and then separating from Neptune and immediately pushing up with Saturn is sort of like, what was an idea? What was an ideal? What was the creative, illusion, even sort of, Neptune's deception or fantasy that was sort of communicated? Or, maybe some of you were brainstorming, when you creative brainstorm, a lot of it is fantasy. Maybe you don't always take every piece of it. So with Neptune, it's not always like you're being deceived. It's just sometimes like, in order to be, with Mercury ruling your Gemini fifth house of creativity, it's sort of like, in order to be creative, sometimes you kind of have to get lost in illusion. And it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means you're eventually going to take the bits and bops of that illusion to then create the thing. So I think, creatives, artists, or if creativity is heavily involved in what you do, that could be kind of a theme this week, where once Mercury starts to separate from Neptune and apply to Saturn with Mars, I think this is where it's like the reality starts to set in. It's sort of like, okay, now that we have what's transpired, what's the logical plan? What's the step-by-step? What pieces are you going to take to actually make a reality? Saturn is like, what's authentic? What's real? What are you actually going to build? So I think with Mercury and Mars applying to Saturn, now it's sort of like Mercury ruling your Gemini fifth house, also your Virgo eighth house, is sort of like, what real resources are necessary? What real decisions do you have to make in order to transform? So some of you could be, especially with Mercury ruling the eighth and the eighth being transformation, a lot of people think transformation is like, like wizardry. But, when I think of transformation, it's sometimes just a very practical making a decision. And you make a choice and that changes everything and you can't go back. And so some of you could be really making a decision around what brings you joy. Some of you with Mercury ruling the fifth house where children land, if that's applicable to you, some of you could be making a decision regarding family planning or children, resources that, you're building, you're moving on with. So there's a lot of opportunity for big decisions here and what they specifically mean for Aquarius risings. But with Mercury and Mars applying to Saturn, and Saturn ruling your first house of self and your Capricorn 12th house of mental thought patterns behind the scenes, I think the best course of action here is like not only what's real and what you really want to build, especially over the next couple years, but what decisions are necessary that are really going to support your physical body, your mental health, your ability to have time to rest and recharge and support your thought patterns. So also getting clear on not just, the creative project or the money or the resources, but really also asking yourselves, Aquarius risings, like what's really going to support me? What feels good for me? Because, say you create things or, the money and the resources come, but you feel like crap or you're mentally just, tired, exhausted. It's not going to feel as good. So I think the Mercury Mars situation is having you get clear on like real motivations, real desires around, that Scorpio Mars ruled area, which is your 10th house of career, business, public recognition, um, and what you really want to commit to there, where you want to create longevity around, but in a way where you're looking at the necessary decisions with Mercury, the necessary resources, and like how it's really gonna bring you joy. And I think with Saturn involved, it's like tangible joy, not this idea of joy. So I think that's a specific thing that might resonate with some Aquarius risings around the time, is like sometimes we think of a creative project or, things playing out with career and like, all of this is like, you know, you get lost in the idea of things, which is great for creativity and, dreaming up what you want to create a tangible reality around. But don't forget about like real tangible joy. Like if it's not going, like I think with Saturn here as sort of the boundary, it's like, no, no, no. Like with Mercury ruling your 5th house of joy, pushing up against Saturn, the boundary, it's like, no, no. What's really gonna bring you real joy for some Aquarius risings? Not this idea of what you think it is, but really real joy. So that might resonate with some of you. Now, additionally, on April 17th, there will be this new moon at 27 degrees in that Aries 3rd house. So I think this is another indicator that new chapter where it's in cardinal, it's initiating. So initiating a new chapter, initiating, what's transpiring around this time. And I think, the Mercury Mars pushing up against Saturn, Mars takes about 2.5 years to make a full lap around with the cycle. So, a new story playing out with Mars and Saturn that could be playing out over the next 2.5 years. Mercury pushing up against Saturn for roughly the next year or so, depending on the retrogrades. So those are longer cycles. So I think this new moon comes along because the new moon to the full moon is about 5-6 months. So I think this new moon comes along and says, why don't we break this down instead of like a year or 2.5 years, whatever's initiating around this time, let's not get too lost in, how long this is going to take. Let's just break this down into a shorter segment of maybe 5 or 6 months. So I think this could be a good time for a lot of Aquarius risings to kind of sit back and say, all right, what's coming up around this time, what you want to focus on, what you want to build, the plan of action, the commitment, the real tangible reality with Saturn, and those Mercury ruled themes that I just discussed, and how, you can break it down into like shorter, digestible goals. And this new moon is conjunct Chiron. And I think, there's a lot of interpretations of this. Chiron is the wounded healer. So I think some of you love Chiron and you're going to be so ready for all this fire. And, depending on your natal chart, you're going to be like, I love Chiron. I love the wounded healer. I love, self-development and stepping into new chapters and seeing what it reflects back to me. And using that as like a creative source and like desire and motivation, which can be, wonderful. Trust me, I know. But some of you, this might be that transition of, because this happens really fast. We really don't get the, Neptune and Aries will happen once in our lifetime. And so with Saturn, Mars, and Mercury all passing through Saturn in a relatively short period of time, where Mercury and Mars push through Neptune and then apply to Saturn, is sort of like that transition of moving through that Neptunian like creativity and illusion and ideals, and then immediately get hit with Saturn, the boundaries, the reality. It's sort of honestly disorienting, I think, where, that really doesn't happen often. So I think the Chiron conjunct the new moon is like so much could be happening where a lot of you are initiating new ideas, new chapters, etc. of what I've discussed this far, or just take what resonates. But I think the Chiron, the wounded healer, could be sort of that, how fast things are happening, how quickly things went from being that Neptunian idea or fantasy in our minds to, holy crap, it's a reality now. We're back down to earth. So again, sort of like sometimes it can feel really good to just be in the ideas and the creativity and sort of like the illusion of things where you're just allowing yourself to kind of like brainstorm and be in that energy, and then coming back down to earth to actually build that thing can be such a contrast for so much of us, so many of us. So that could be a possibility that I've kind of contemplated with the Chiron, like, what's the crunchy bit here with this new chapter and new beginning? And I think things are just happening so rapidly and so fast. But, I also want to point out that even if it feels uncomfortable, this pile up in Aries in your third house will be sextile your first house of self. So whatever is happening around this time, if it even feels uncomfortable, I would say, like, how is it pushing you to improve and create more value to yourself? Right? The sextile to the first is like creating opportunity to even create more value, an opportunity you have to take. But the sextile to your first house, even if it, and I say this if it feels uncomfortable around this time. If not, don't worry about it. But if it feels uncomfortable, Aquarius Rising, like, yes, things could be happening fast or, moving you in a different direction, building things in a new way. But always remembering, like, always coming back to the self, like, how is this creating more value to valuing yourself, your physical body, how you want to feel, how you want to move through the world. And also remembering, like, this is also going to trine your Sagittarius 11th house of friends, groups, communities, and long-term goals, which could also be career related for some of you too. If your midheaven or your MC is in your Sagittarius 11th house. So, so much as initiating that could be like, wow, fast, uncomfortable, whatnot, like big changes, new ways of doing things, it could be helping you in the long run really dissolve those obstacles to the dreams, the aspirations, the long-term goals, and the social network that you really want to surround yourself with, as well as the trine to your Leo 7th house of personal and professional partnerships. So really, like, shifting things here could actually be kind of shifting your life to redirect you to the right connections, more flow, and the dissolution of obstacles to personal and professional partnerships. So whatever shifting and changing, like, also keep that bigger picture in mind of like how it might actually be redirecting you in a positive way to bigger and better things in your personal and professional partnerships, your long-term goals, your social network, etc. And lastly, we get to April 19th. Sunday, April 19th. That is when Mercury, Mars, and Saturn will be at that 7-degree mark in your Aries third house of communication, exchanging information, etc. And when Mercury, Saturn, and Mars are at the 7-degree mark, they're going to be in a quincunx to the South Node in your Virgo 8th house of transformation. So potentially, you know, big decisions or those long-term financial themes, resources, partners' resources, if applicable. So, Sunday going into Monday, there could be this very subtle opportunity to make slight adjustments. It's a quincunx, so this could also feel uncomfortable, but it's still an opportunity to make an adjustment to create more balance. And so, whatever's going on here with all that I've discussed with the conjunctions, the applying, the separating, whatnot, Mercury, Saturn, and Mars, right? The ruler of your creativity, your joy, also the ruler of this 8th house of transformational work, decisions, resources, finances. Saturn, the ruler of you, also the ruler of your subconscious thought patterns behind the scenes, as well as Mars, ruling this Aries 3rd house of communication, but also your 10th house of career, business, public recognition, all kind of come together and provide this opportunity to maybe adjust something to a decision, transformational work, sort of resources, long-term finances, even a partner's resources, if applicable, or vice versa to this situation. So I think there's a subtle adjustment going on. But I think this subtle adjustment could also potentially be playing in to supporting Uranus's final ingress into this Gemini 5th house of joy, creativity, children, if applicable to you, because Mercury is involved in this quincunx to the South Node in this Mercury-ruled area, your Virgo 8th house, where this adjustment between your communication, your everyday environment, technology, transportation, maybe relationships with siblings, extended family, and the adjustment to this other Mercury ruled area, again, your Virgo 8th house of what adjustments are you making in your everyday immediate environment or with communication, technology, transportation that could be career related for many of you. The adjustment to those themes and sort of the long-term resources, the transformation, decisions maybe necessary to make that adjustment that could be helping some of you actually support Uranus's ingress into the other Mercury ruled area of your Gemini 5th house, where Uranus is going to make that final ingress next week for roughly the next 7 years being there to innovate, change the creativity, the self-expression, children, if applicable to you, what brings you joy. So I think some of you, even if it's an uncomfortable adjustment, it could be helping prepare that innovation, that change necessary to your creativity, your self-expression, what brings you joy, as Uranus makes that final ingress into that Gemini 5th house starting next week, which I will break down in your April monthly horoscope part 4 shortly. Hi, Pisces Risings. So on Monday, April 13th, we have Mars officially separating from Neptune and pushing up against Saturn, happening in your Aries 2nd house of earned income, your value system, self-worth. So Mars is going to be pushing up against Saturn for the majority of this week. And I think this could really kind of intensify the plan of action, the desire, the motivation regarding a long-term goal, what's been going on behind the scenes, mental thought patterns, and the impact to your overall growth and potential, which could be sort of, continuing education, higher knowledge, travel, publishing, teaching, or career-related themes for some of you. Where some of you could also be sort of literally with Mars being in rulership in your 2nd house of earned income. Some of you could be really looking at your financial situation and, what's going on with your financial situation and the overall plan of action for travel, continuing education, career related themes, publishing, teaching, spirituality, as well. That could be kind of playing into that long term goal and what you've been thinking about, maybe behind the scenes that now some of you maybe really want to take action to build, literally, with Saturn. So once we get to April 14th, April 14th is an interesting day because for the majority of the day, Mercury is going to be at 29 degrees, that aneretic degree, sense of urgency degree in your Pisces first house of self, physical body. So as a Pisces rising, some of you could feel that intensity or that urgency with Mercury being here, sextile Uranus at 29 degrees in your Taurus third house. So with Mercury ruling your seventh house of personal and professional partnership, as well as your Gemini fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate, some of you might be looking for the opportunity or sort of having that sense of urgency around a family matter, a personal and professional partnership situation, where you're looking for the opportunity to maybe create more value even to sort of home, family, property, real estate. Some of you could be seeing sort of like an opportunity with the sextile or the desire to create more value, to create a new outcome to the emotional and physical foundation of your lives, or maybe create sort of new outcomes to your connections with others, a personal and professional partnership, including marriage, if applicable to you. So again, this sextile could bring up a lot of specific themes, but I think, definitely pay attention to what could be intensifying or themes that could be really coming up Monday, Tuesday, because late on Tuesday, certainly as we get into Wednesday, that's when Mercury is going to officially move into your Aries second house of earned income and self-worth. I want to point out, Mercury was at that aneretic degree, that sense of urgency in a water sign, and then hours later moves into a fire sign. So some of you could really feel that shift in energy of, that closing sextile with Mercury. Again, as I said, paying attention to what really kind of intensifies or comes up, or maybe some of you feel a sense of urgency around. Some of you could feel a sense of urgency around a family matter, property, real estate. Some of you could feel a sense of urgency around something happening in your marriage, personal and professional partnerships, that hours later, as Mercury moves into your this fire sign, this Aries second house of earned income and self-worth, it's sort of like a shift in that energy. And so with Mercury moving into your second house, immediately applying to Neptune, this could bring up sort of a shift, a change in ideal. Some of you could be communicating sort of new ideals, new potentials, brainstorming something regarding home, family, property, real estate, relationships with family, personal and professional partnerships. That's what Mercury rules in your chart. So this is where sort of like what comes up Monday, Tuesday that could have a sense of urgency now shifts into, okay, well, what's the new ideal here? Like what's dissolving, what's surrendering, what's sort of shifting around the home, family, property, real estate, or the personal, professional partnership, including marriage. That could also involve your finances, your value system, and your self-worth, because this Mercury-Neptune conjunction is happening in the second house of earned income and self-worth. So I think, something could sort of peak, or there could be a sense of urgency around that then shifts you into an entirely different conversation or, way of working things out regarding those themes. But then when we get to Friday, April 17th, this is when Mercury starts to separate from Neptune and apply to Saturn with Mars. So this is where whatever maybe was going on within a personal and professional partnership, maybe whatever's going on with home, family, property, real estate themes, this is when that situation could now shift into like a hard reality. Because Mercury and Mars are now pushing up against Saturn, the planet of longevity, commitment, authenticity, what's real. And so maybe you kind of initially were in this phase of like, okay, what's the ideal? Like, what do we need to talk about? What's going on here? And then as you get into Friday, April 17th, moving forward, that's when it's sort of like, okay, it's not just an idea anymore. It's not just the ideal. It's not just the brainstorming session or sort of, what's up in your mind. It's what are we really doing about it? I think this is where whatever the home, family, property, real estate, or what's going on within personal and professional partnerships, including marriage, this is when I think a lot of Pisces risings, you might shift into a phase of like, nope, what's real? What's the brass tacks? How much money is it really? What's the reality? What are we building? What are we dealing with moving forward, basically? And what's interesting is at this point, Mars and Mercury are pushing up against Saturn, and Saturn rules your 11th house of long-term goals, dreams, aspirations, social network. So some of you could be really kind of like stepping into a new chapter of long-term goals, dreams, aspirations. Maybe something shifted, like something happened, and now you're like, no, I need to kind of step into building and focusing on the long-term goals in a real way. So some of you could be focusing on the long-term goal in a very Saturnian way where you're like, nope, like it's not just an idea, it's not just an illusion or a creative idea. This is something I want to build for the long term over the next year or two with the planetary cycles. So again, I think this could be either like a partnership or, a home, family, property, real estate matter. Or some of you could be like, all right, what's the financial situation where I can really build towards the long-term goal, the dream, the aspiration, and getting very real about the people you need to surround yourself with in order to achieve that, or the people you need to surround yourself with that are part of that real, tangible picture. So I think a lot of Pisces risings, you could be getting very real, but in a way where you're also, because this is all happening in your second house, you could be getting very real about your values, your self-worth, your finances, and, Mercury and Mars are pushing up against Saturn here, and Saturn's like, no, what's real? What's logical? What's the real reality here, and how do we really build this new reality that supports your self-worth, your values, your long-term goals, but also integrates what could really be gearing up to shift and change with Uranus's final ingress into that Mercury ruled area of your Gemini fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate. So when we get to April 19th, this is when, nope, I'm going back. Sorry, still on April 17th. So much happening on this day. So still on April 17th, sorry for the confusion, there is still a new moon at 27 degrees in your April. My God. I just have to say, I'm recording this early when Mercury is retrograde opposite my exalted Mercury And I apologize. It's so insane how these transits literally physically manifest. It's wild. Okay, pause, rewind, going back, still on April 17th, Friday. There is this new moon at 27 degrees in your Aries second house of earned income and self-worth. So this is an additional layer where like there's more initiating this new chapter where Mercury and Mars are initiating this new cycle, this new story kind of playing out with home and family, partnership, even sort of your overall growth and potential, finances, and Saturn kind of saying, what's the longevity? What's the commitment regarding these long-term goals going on at this time? Where this new moon is kind of saying, all right, let's step into this new chapter and initiate. But with the moon cycles, you know, the new moon to the corresponding full moon could be about 5-6 months. So I think with these planets, you know, Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, these are longer planetary cycles. And I think this new moon comes along and says, you know what, let's just focus on the next 5 or 6 months. So I think if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed, I think this new moon comes along and says, how can we break this down into a more digestible time frame with what's initiating around this time? So again, like breaking it down into a more digestible time frame, focusing on the next 5 or 6 months, initiating, you know, something that could be very real, very tangible, regarding those themes that I mentioned. But this new moon is also conjunct Chiron. And Chiron's the wounded healer. So as I've said with pretty much all the rising signs, you know, some people love Chiron. They love, you know, the wounded healer. They love what new chapters and new directions sort of mirror back to them, and how we help others and how that reflects things back to us. And then sometimes Chiron can be a little challenging. It can be a little uncomfortable, especially depending on where your natal Chiron is. And so I've sat with this, and I think there's a lot of different interpretations with what this Chiron conjunct the new moon could mean. But I think this Chiron, if it feels uncomfortable or sort of that like sense of woundedness, I think it could have a lot to do with how much is happening in such a short period of time this month, if not this whole year. And I think, you know, I want to pull back and remind you that Mercury and Mars, even Saturn, have all pushed beyond Neptune's limits. And Neptune and Saturn are very different. So it's sort of like we've pushed through that Neptunian like ideal and illusion and fantasy and, you know, what's really happening, you know, what's going on. It's all kind of this idea, or maybe it's not like a total tangible reality, to then moving beyond the limit of Neptune and immediately being met with Saturn's hard fist of hard reality. What's real? What are you building? What are you committing to now that everything has unfolded at this point? And so this is where I think Chiron might come into that, or might be playing into it. Again, this is like my interpretation. I could be totally wrong. Take it or leave it. But I think the Chiron kind of woundedness going on with this new moon is sort of like what's beginning around this time. Maybe it's really, maybe it's new and it's like a step in the right direction, but it's uncomfortable. Or maybe it's happened so fast, you're still trying to digest it. And I think sometimes when we go from like Neptune to Saturn, it can almost have that Chiron effect of like, whoa, this was like we were brainstorming, this was an idea, this was like in my head, I was like kind of lost in the illusion of it or the fantasy of it. of like what could really happen or where we're really going with this, to pretty much immediately meeting Saturn's like, no, we're on Earth. What's real? What's tangible? And sort of that hard contrast of anytime we take something that's like an idea, a creativity, illusion, it's all, brainstorming in the head with that Neptunian kind of feel to it. Even deception, Neptune can be very deceiving. To then moving into Saturnian energy of, oh, now we got to do the thing. We have to make the change. We actually have to build the idea. Sometimes it's nice to be kind of in the what's possible, what's the potential, what's the idea, versus now we got to do the thing. And so I think with Chiron conjunct the new moon on April 17th, like that could be a possibility with such change in April, again, between like where we're trying to move through Neptune and then immediately be met with reality with Saturn. That could be hard for a lot of us. So again, some of you might love it. Some of you might be like, whoa, I need a nap. I need a transition phase between this. And just remember that whatever is happening in this second house and its influence with Chiron and this new moon and a lot of initiating, stuff going on here, I would say, like, if it does feel uncomfortable, take a step back and see how it can maybe be having you really evaluate your overall wellness, your vitality, maybe having you reevaluate your life, your routines, like the routines that really support the work, the health and vitality you want to feel. Like sometimes when I've gone through really, really challenging transitions in my life, I look back and I'm like, wow, that really forced me to stop going the way that I was going. It forced me to change my work, my health, and my routines. And in doing that, it really dissolved those obstacles that, were really hard to work through prior. So sometimes like what's going on here can really help you really reevaluate your routines. What really is a supportive routine for your work and your health. And then some of you might be able to go through all of this here in this Aries second house and notice how it's trying your 10th house of career, business, and public recognition and what you find fulfilling. So this could really be helping you sort of set new chapters and create like these real tangible realities in the second house. But it could also, like, if you zoom out, some of you might be able to see how it could be setting the stage to dissolve the obstacles towards the career, the business, the public recognition, or things that feel more fulfilling to you. So again, zooming out and seeing how what is temporarily happening right now could actually be dissolving obstacles and providing more flow to other areas of your life down the road. Getting to April 19th now. So Sunday, April 19th. This is an interesting day because I think this might provide the opportunity to make some necessary adjustments if necessary, if desired. This is when Mercury, Mars, and Saturn will be sitting at that 7-degree mark, quincunx the South Node in your Virgo 7th house of personal and professional partnerships, including marriage. So the quincunx is a minor aspect. It could be an adjustment going on, even a subtle adjustment going on in the background. So some of you could be making adjustments to finances, value system, versus, how you connect with others or things happening within your current long-term partnerships, including marriage. Especially because Mercury is involved in this quincunx and Mercury rules the 7th house of personal and professional partnerships. But I would say for a lot of Pisces risings, this could be the time where there's adjustments between finances, self-worth, personal and professional partnerships, or the partnerships you do want to connect with, and the adjustments necessary to anchor yourselves in your self-worth, your value system to do so. Either way, whether you're partnered up or whether you're single, notice the adjustments that might be kind of coming up in subtle ways, because Mercury involved in this quincunx, this adjustment to this Virgo Mercury ruled seventh house of personal and professional partnerships could definitely amplify that adjustment. But Mercury also rules your Gemini fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate, where Uranus is going to make the final ingress into your Gemini fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate next week for roughly the next 7 years. And so this Mercury quincunx, this Mercury adjustment to the South Node in your seventh house of partnership, personal or professional, marriage, or the partnerships you do want to connect with. This adjustment could be helping Uranus's ingress into this other Mercury ruled area, your Gemini fourth house of home, family, property, and real estate. So whatever adjustments are happening maybe between like your value system, your self-worth, your finances, how you connect with others, things happening within your current long-term partnerships, that could be kind of setting the stage for Uranus making that final ingress into that other Mercury ruled area where a lot of change and innovation could be taking place for roughly the next 7 years for some Pisces risings. So definitely stay tuned for your April monthly horoscope part 4, where I will break down that Uranus ingress into that Gemini fourth house for you.